Welcome back. Take a slow breath in and let it out gently. Settle into wherever you are tonight. Loosen your shoulders, let your hands rest. If the lights are still on, you can dim them now, or simply close your eyes and listen. Tonight we are going to drift very far from the modern world. Far from notifications, far from traffic, far from the soft electric hum that fills nearly every room you have ever slept in. We are going to a place where the only sounds were wind, water, and the slow turning of a great oil lamp at the top of a tall stone tower. We are going to spend the next few hours in the quiet world of medieval lighthouse keepers. Men, and sometimes women, who lived alone on rocky coasts and lonely islands, sometimes for many years at a time, tending the small fires that guided ships through the dark. There is no need to remember any of it. There is no test, no questions, nothing you have to follow. The story is simply a long, slow path, and you can walk along it for as long as you wish and step off it into sleep whenever you are ready. Imagine, for a moment, the kind of darkness that no longer exists in most of the world. A darkness without streetlights. A darkness without the distant glow of cities on the horizon. A darkness so complete that, on a cloudy night, a sailor could stand on the deck of his ship and not see his own hand in front of his face. The sea, in such darkness, became a kind of living riddle. Below the water lay shallow rocks, sandbars, half-submerged wrecks, narrow channels between cliffs. Above the water, only stars, if the sky was clear. And if it was not clear, only the sound of waves slapping against unseen stone, getting closer and closer and closer. It was into this darkness that the lighthouse keeper sent his small, steady light. The earliest lighthouses, of course, are older than the Middle Ages. The Greeks and Romans built towers along their busiest shipping lanes, the most famous being the great lighthouse of Alexandria, which stood for over 1,000 years before earthquakes finally brought it down. But when the Roman Empire fell, much of that knowledge faded. The roads cracked, the aqueducts ran dry. Many of the old coastal towers were abandoned, their stones carried off by villagers to build cottages and walls. For several centuries, the coasts of Europe grew darker again. Ships ran aground more often, whole crews vanished into the surf, leaving nothing but broken wood washing onto morning beaches. And then, slowly, very slowly, the lights came back. In the early medieval period, the first new beacons were not towers at all. They were simple fires, lit on hilltops, or on the roofs of cliffside churches, or in iron baskets hoisted onto wooden poles near harbour mouths. Monks were often the keepers of these earliest flames. A small monastery on a headland might have, as one of its quiet duties, the responsibility of feeding a fire every night, year after year, decade after decade. The monks took turns. One brother might climb the narrow stairs at dusk, light the fire, sit beside it through part of the night, and then return to his cell before dawn. Another brother would take the next watch. It was unglamorous work. There were no songs written about it, no knights performed it. It was simply something that needed to be done, because without it, sailors would die. This connection between lighthouses and monasteries is one of the gentlest threads in the whole long history of these towers. The monks understood patience, they understood routine, they understood that the same small action, repeated every evening for a lifetime, could be a form of devotion. In some places, the lighthouse and the chapel were the same building. The fire that warmed the altar was the same fire that in a smaller iron basin was carried up to the high window to be set burning above the rocks. A traveller approaching by sea might see a single flame far across the water, and not know whether he was looking at a place of worship, or a warning, or both at the same time. The men who eventually took over this work, when the role passed from monks to laymen, inherited that same slow rhythm. They lived by the turning of the day. The light went on at dusk. The light went off at dawn. In between they tended it. That was the whole of their work, told in a single sentence. But of course, the truth of their lives was much longer than a single sentence, and it stretched out across the centuries in ways that even they could not have imagined. Let us begin with the tower itself. A medieval lighthouse, in its most common form, was a stone cylinder. It was not as tall as the great modern towers we know today, with their elegant white stripes and bright revolving beams. A medieval tower might be only 30 feet high, sometimes 50. Occasionally, on a particularly important headland, it might reach 80 or 100. The walls were thick, often 4 or 5 feet of solid stone at the base, narrowing slightly toward the top. The thickness was not a matter of vanity, it was a matter of survival. The wind on an exposed coast can blow with a force that is difficult to describe to someone who has never stood in it. A storm wind can lean against a building, hour after hour, like a great patient hand pressing down. A thin wall would crack, a thick wall held. Inside, the tower was usually a hollow shaft with a stone staircase spiraling up along the inner wall. The stairs were uneven. They were cut by hand, by stonemasons who worked with hammer and chisel, and who measured each step roughly by the length of their own boot. As a result, no two stairs were quite the same height. A keeper who climbed those stairs every evening, for years, learnt them in his legs without ever thinking about it. He knew the slightly taller third step. He knew the worn place on the seventh, where rainwater had pooled for generations and softened the stone. He knew that the 11th step, near the curve, sometimes rocked a little when you put your weight on the outer edge. None of this was written anywhere. It lived only in his feet. At the top of the tower was the lantern room. This was a small chamber, often round, with windows on all sides. The windows were not made of clear glass, the way modern windows are. Medieval glass was thick and full of bubbles, slightly green or amber in colour, and uneven. Some lantern rooms had no glass at all, only open arches, with the wind blowing freely through. In those open towers, the fire had to be sheltered from the worst of the gusts by stone hoods or iron screens. In glassed towers, the panes were always smudged with soot, no matter how often the keeper wiped them, because the smoke from the fire rose up and clung to everything inside. The fire itself was the heart of the whole operation. In the earliest medieval lighthouses, the fire was simply wood. Logs were carried up the stairs, one armful at a time, and burned in an iron grate at the centre of the lantern room. Wood, as you can imagine, was not ideal. It burned quickly. It threw sparks. It produced enormous amounts of smoke. A keeper might need to bring up 2, 3, 4 loads of wood every single night, climbing the spiral stairs again and again in the dark, his arms full, his breath short. By morning his hands would be black with soot. His clothes would smell of smoke, and his eyes would be red from the haze. Later, in many places, the fuel changed. Coal was used in some regions, particularly in northern Europe, where coal was plentiful and burned hotter and longer than wood. Coal had its own problems. It was heavy to carry up the stairs. It left thick black ash that had to be shoveled out and disposed of. The smoke was darker and oilier, and stained the inside of the lantern room a deep permanent black, no matter how often it was scrubbed. But coal gave a brighter, steadier light, and it lasted longer between refuelings, so the keeper could sit by his fire for a stretch of hours without having to leave it. In other places, the fuel was oil. Whale oil, in particular, became the preferred lighthouse fuel in many coastal regions during the later medieval and early modern periods. Whale oil burned with a bright, clean flame, and it could be fed into a wick that produced a remarkably steady light. The oil was stored in barrels at the base of the tower and carried up in jugs and tin canisters. The keeper would pour it into a brass or iron lamp, trim the wick, and light it with a small taper from a candle. Once lit, the lamp could burn for several hours before it needed to be refilled. This meant the keeper no longer had to spend the entire night carrying logs and tending an open fire. He could sit beside his lamp, check it every hour or so, and rest in between. This shift from wood to coal to oil played out slowly over hundreds of years, and it is part of what changed the daily rhythm of the keeper's life. The earlier you go in the medieval period, the more physical the work. The later you go, the more the work becomes a kind of quiet waiting. But in both cases, the central truth was the same. Someone had to be there. Someone had to make sure the fire did not go out. If the fire went out, ships could die. Let us think about that for a moment. In a modern city, if a street light burns out, no one is particularly affected. The neighborhood is darker for a night, perhaps, until a city worker comes by to replace the bulb. There are other lights. There is moonlight. There are headlights. Nobody dies. But in the world we are imagining, a single lighthouse might be the only warning for a stretch of coast many miles long. If a ship was sailing toward that coast at night, in a storm, the keeper's small flame might be the only piece of information the captain had about where he was. If the flame was visible, the captain could steer wide of the rocks. If the flame was missing, the captain could not. The ship would sail into the unseen reef, the hull would split, the masts would crack, and the men aboard would be thrown into water so cold that even the strongest swimmer would lose feeling in his arms within minutes. The keeper, sitting in his small stone room, knew this. He could not see the ships. He could not hear them, except in the rarest of conditions. He could not know how many were out there on any given night. But he knew that, as long as his light was burning, his job was being done. As long as the wick was trimmed, the oil was flowing, the smoke was rising. Somewhere out in the darkness, a captain was looking toward him and saying to his crew, "There, that is the headland. We are safe. We can steer past." This knowledge that you might be saving lives without ever seeing the people you were saving shaped a particular kind of person. The medieval lighthouse keeper was, almost by definition, a man who could live with invisible consequences. He would never receive a letter of thanks from the captain whose ship he had guided home. He would never meet the wife who still had a husband because the light had been burning. He would never know whether, on any particular night, his light had mattered at all, or whether the sea had been empty, or whether the ships had passed safely on their own. He simply lit the lamp. He simply trimmed the wick. He simply sat through the night. Now, who were these keepers? Where did they come from? How did one end up living alone in a stone tower on a windswept rock? The answers vary across centuries and regions, but there are a few common paths. Some keepers, as we have already said, began as monks. Their monasteries were granted land on coastal promontories, often by kings or local lords who wanted the religious community to take responsibility for maintaining a beacon. When the monasteries declined, or when the Reformation closed many of them, the lighthouses sometimes passed to lay keepers who continued the work as a paid trade. Other keepers came from local fishing villages. A man might grow up in a small coastal community, learn the sea from his father, and then in middle age take a position at the nearby lighthouse, either to supplement his income or because the work was steadier than fishing. Such men often brought their wives and children with them, especially if the lighthouse had any form of cottage attached. The whole family would live together at the base of the tower, sharing the work. The husband would tend the light at night. The wife would cook, clean, mend, manage the small kitchen garden, and help with refueling. The children would carry messages down to the village, gather firewood from the shore, and learn the trade by watching. Other keepers were veterans of war, broken men who had come back from the long medieval conflicts and could not return to ordinary village life. The Crusades, the endless border wars, the dynastic struggles, All produced men who had seen too much. Some of these men found, in the lonely tower on the headland, a kind of refuge. The work was quiet, the duties were simple, the neighbours were few, and the sea, with its long horizon, asked no questions. A man who could not sleep in a crowded village might sleep more easily with only the sound of waves outside his window. Still other keepers were exiles of one sort or another. Men who had committed minor crimes, or fallen out of favour with a lord, or carried some private shame, sometimes ended up as lighthouse keepers because no one else wanted the job and they had no better options. In a few cases, the position was almost a sentence. A man might be sent to a lighthouse as a form of dignified banishment, given a small salary and a stone room, and told to remain there. The community received its light. The lord was rid of the awkward neighbour. The man himself might come to find the arrangement more peaceful than the world he had left. What all these keepers shared, regardless of how they had arrived, was the long shape of their days. A medieval keeper's day was structured by the sun. He woke at first light, or shortly after, depending on the season. In summer, this might be very early indeed, 3 or 4 in the morning. In winter, it might be closer to 8. His first task, almost always, was to check the lamp. If it was still burning, he would extinguish it now that daylight had come. If it had burned itself out during the night, he would simply note that and clean up the residue. Then he would let himself sleep again, often for several hours of the morning. The keeper's life was, in many ways, lived on a reversed schedule. The fullest part of his working day was the night. So during the day he caught his rest in fragments. A few hours after dawn, perhaps another hour or 2 in the afternoon, he learnt to nap in chairs, in doorways, against sun-warmed stones. The deep, uninterrupted sleep of an ordinary villager was not available to him. Instead, he gathered his rest in pieces, like a man picking up coins from the ground, and counted himself fortunate to find a handful in any given 24 hours. Around mid-morning, he would rise again, often for the second time, and begin his maintenance work. The lamp had to be cleaned. The brass parts had to be polished, because soot built up quickly and could clog the wick. The glass of the lantern room, if there was glass, had to be washed inside and out. The keeper would climb a small ladder and wipe each pane with a rag dipped in water and vinegar, working slowly, taking care not to break the fragile, bubbled glass. He would scrub the stone floor of the lantern room. He would sweep up ash, if coal was the fuel. He would check the supply of oil or fuel, and if it was running low, he would bring up a fresh barrel from below. The barrels themselves were the source of much of the keeper's physical labour. A full barrel of whale oil might weigh 60 or 70 pounds. To carry it up a narrow spiral staircase, in the half-dark, was a slow and careful job. Most keepers did not try to wrestle the whole barrel up the stairs at once. Instead, they would tip it over at the base, pour some of the oil into a smaller jug or canister, and carry the smaller container up. They would empty it into the lamp reservoir, then descend and repeat. This task could take an hour or more, and it had to be done every several days, depending on the lamp's appetite for oil and the length of the nights. By midday, the keeper might pause for a meal. His food was simple: bread baked once a week or once every 2 weeks, dense and dark and made to last. Cheese kept wrapped in cloth in the cool stone of the lower room. Saltfish, of course, in coastal locations, since fish was the most abundant local food. Sometimes a vegetable from the garden, if there was one. Onions, especially, kept well through long months, and a keeper might eat onions in some form nearly every day. He might drink small beer, which was a weak ale brewed for daily use, much safer than river water in many places. He might drink water from a rain cistern, which the lighthouse usually had on its roof, collecting whatever the sky was willing to give. In wine-producing regions, he might have a small jug of thin local wine, watered down to make it last. The meal would be eaten alone, or in family lighthouses with whoever was present. The keeper would chew slowly, as people did in those centuries, partly because the bread was hard, and partly because there was no reason to rush. He had nowhere to be. The afternoon was his, more or less, and the afternoon was long. In the afternoon the keeper attended to his other duties. He might walk down to the rocks at low tide and gather seaweed, which had many uses. Some seaweeds were eaten, others were dried and used to insulate walls or stuff mattresses. Still others were burned, and their ash was rich in potash, which could be sold to soap makers and glass makers in the nearest town. He might check the small fishing lines he had set out at dawn, pulling in a fish or two for the evening's meal. He might tend his garden, if he had one. Lighthouse gardens were small and hardy. Cabbage, turnips, a few herbs, whatever could survive the constant wind and the salt that drifted in on every breeze. He might also walk a short distance inland to the nearest village, perhaps once a week, to trade for supplies. The village might be a mile away, or 3 miles, or in some cases more than 10, requiring a long round trip that took most of the day. The keeper would carry whatever he had to trade, perhaps a basket of dried fish, or a small jug of cured potash, or a few pence saved from his salary. He would buy bread, salt, oil, candles, perhaps a needle and thread. He would exchange brief greetings with the villagers. He would not stay long. He had to be back before dusk, because the light had to be lit, and there was no one else to do it. This is one of the central, unbreakable facts of the medieval keeper's life. He could not be gone at sunset, not for any reason. If he was injured walking back from the village and could not reach the tower, ships might die. If he caught a fever and could not climb the stairs, ships might die. If he simply lay down for a nap and did not wake up at the right hour, ships might die. The schedule was not flexible. The sun did not negotiate. Every evening, without fail, the lamp had to be lit, and the keeper had to be the one to light it. This is part of why so many keepers became, over time, very still men. The work taught them to plan carefully, to avoid risk, to not wander too far, to not drink too much, to not pick fights, to not borrow trouble. The tower trained them in a kind of quiet steadiness that was the opposite of medieval village life, which was often loud, chaotic, full of feast days and brawls and gossip. The keeper learnt to step back from all of that, not because he disapproved, necessarily, but because he simply could not afford to be part of it. As the afternoon faded, the keeper would begin his evening preparations. He would check the lamp one more time. He would clean the wick if needed, trimming the burned end with a small pair of scissors kept just for this purpose. He would refill the oil reservoir if it had run low during the previous night. He would set out a small supply of fuel near at hand, so that if the lamp needed adjustment in the dark, he would not have to fumble around looking for it. He would lay out his own things, a blanket, a stool, a small clay lamp for his personal use, a piece of bread for the watch. Then he would wait for the sun. The moment of lighting was, in many keepers' descriptions, a small ritual. Not religious, necessarily, though for some keepers it certainly carried religious weight. More like the careful attention a craftsman gives to the beginning of a piece of work. The keeper would watch the sun touch the horizon. He would wait for the first true dimming of the sky. Then he would climb the last few steps to the lantern room, take a small flame from his clay lamp, and touch it to the wick of the great lamp. The wick would catch, the flame would steady, the light would spread, and then he would sit down beside it. It is hard to describe to a modern listener what the next several hours were like. There was no entertainment. There were no books for most keepers, because most keepers could not read, and even those who could had very few books available. There was no music, There were no other voices, unless he was speaking to himself or to the wind. There was only the small flicker of the great lamp, the much smaller flicker of his own clay lamp, the sound of wind outside the stone walls, and the occasional creak of the tower as it settled in the cold. The keeper learnt to inhabit this silence. He had to. There was no alternative. Some keepers passed the time with simple handwork. They carved small objects out of driftwood, spoons, combs, little figures of saints, or of ships, or of birds. The carving did not have to be skillful, because no one was going to see it. Some keepers spent years on a single project, a chess set perhaps, or a small model boat. The work filled the hands and let the mind drift. The keeper was not thinking about the carving. He was thinking about whatever passed through his mind, slowly, without pressure. Memories of childhood, the face of a brother who had died long ago. A particular afternoon in summer when he had been a boy and had not yet understood that boys grew older. Other keepers prayed. The repetitive, half-whispered prayers of medieval Christianity were well suited to long, quiet nights. A keeper might recite the same prayer 100 times in a single watch, not out of fervour, but out of habit, the way a fisherman mends nets. The words would weave around the flame, and the flame would weave around the words, and the hours would pass. Still other keepers simply watched the sea, though they could rarely see it well in the dark. They watched the faint reflection of their own light on whatever water was visible. They listened to the waves. They noticed when the wind changed direction, because the wind would change the sound of the waves on the rocks below. A keeper of many years could tell, just by listening, whether the tide was rising or falling, whether a storm was coming, whether the wind had shifted to a quarter that brought danger to certain offshore reefs. This knowledge was not taught. It accumulated. It settled into the keeper the way salt settled into the stones of the tower walls. Slowly, permanently. Around midnight, the keeper might rise from his stool and walk a slow circle around the lantern room. He would stretch his legs, he would check the lamp, he would look out each window in turn, scanning the dark. Most nights he would see nothing but the same dark sea. Occasionally he would see a small light far away, the lantern of a passing ship. He would watch it move, he would note its direction. If it seemed to be heading toward danger, he would feel a tightening in his chest, but there was nothing he could do for it except keep his own light burning and trust that the ship's captain knew what he was looking at. Sometimes, very rarely, the keeper would see a light that vanished. The small, distant lantern would simply wink out. Whether the ship had passed behind a rock, or rounded a headland, or sunk, the keeper could not know. He would mark it in his memory. He would wait for news the next time someone came up from the village. Days later, or weeks later, he might hear that a particular merchant ship had been lost, with all hands, or he might never hear anything at all. The sea kept its own accounts and shared them rarely. This is part of what made the keeper's life so quiet and so heavy at the same time. He carried things he did not speak about. He did not even speak about them to himself in any organized way. He simply carried them, the way the stone tower carried the weight of its own walls. The walls did not complain, they simply held. Now let us consider the rhythm of the longer seasons, because the keeper's life was not the same in summer as it was in winter, and the difference shaped him in ways that went beyond simple weather. In summer, the nights were short. In the high latitudes of northern Europe, summer nights might last only 5 or 6 hours of true darkness. The keeper would light the lamp late, perhaps at 9 or 10 in the evening, and let it burn until 3 or 4 in the morning, when the sky began to lighten. The watches were brief. The work was light. The weather was, more often than not, kind. The wind was warmer. The rain, when it came, was gentler. The sea was calmer. Ships moved easily up and down the coasts, carrying wool, wine, salt, fish, timber, hides. The keeper's light was needed, but it was needed less urgently. Storms were rare, wrecks were uncommon. Summer was also the season when the keeper had visitors. A nephew might come up from the village to spend a week. A travelling priest might stop by on his way to a distant parish. Fishermen, blown slightly off course, might tie up briefly on the rocks below the tower and climb up for an hour to share a meal and exchange news. The keeper, who had spent the long winter mostly alone, would suddenly find himself drawn into conversation. He might not be very good at it at first. The words might come slowly. He might forget the names of common things, but after a day or two of company, he would remember how to talk, and would talk eagerly, sometimes for hours, until his guest grew tired and excused himself to bed. In some seasons, the keeper would also see travelling traders who came along the coast in small boats, selling needles and salt and odd bits of metalwork. He would buy what he could afford. He would ask the trader for news of the wider world. The trader might tell him about a war in a distant country, or about a king who had died, or about a new style of building that was spreading across the cities. The keeper would listen without much reaction. The wider world to him was a kind of rumour. He had not seen most of it. He would not see most of it. But he liked knowing that it was still there, churning along while he sat in his stone tower with his small flame. Winter, of course, was different. Winter was the season the keeper truly earned his keep. The nights were long, in some places lasting 14, 15, 16 hours of darkness. The storms came down out of the north or up from the southwest, depending on the region. The wind would scream against the tower walls for days on end, until the keeper grew so used to it that the rare moments of silence felt strange, even unnerving. The sea would rise. Waves would crash against the rocks below, sending spray so high that in some lighthouses the salt water reached the lantern room itself, pattering against the windows like cold rain. The keeper in winter lit his lamp early and let it burn long. He climbed the stairs more often to check the windows for cracks, to wipe away the salt and the spray, to make sure the lamp had not been blown into an odd angle by the gusts that found their way through cracks in the walls. He carried more fuel, because the lamp burned more, and because he himself needed a small fire in his quarters below just to keep from freezing. He wore layers of wool. He wore a thick cap pulled down over his ears. He wore mittens, even indoors, because the stone of the tower walls grew so cold to the touch that bare hands ached after a few minutes. In the harshest winters, the keeper might not see another human being for weeks at a time. The path to the village would be impassable. The fishing boats would not come. Even the seagulls, in the worst weather, would vanish, finding shelter in the cliffs. The keeper would be alone with the sound of the wind and the sound of the sea, and his own slow movements through the small rooms of his stone home. He would sleep when he could. He would eat what he had. He would tend the lamp. It was in winter that the keeper's psychological strength was most tested. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes when the weather has cut you off from everyone you know, and you do not know when the cutting off will end. It is not the loneliness of a single quiet evening. It is the loneliness of looking out the window in the morning, seeing the storm still raging, seeing the path still buried, and realizing that today, again, no one will come, and then doing the same thing tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Many keepers developed, over the years, small habits that helped them through these long winter stretches. Some kept a journal of sorts, though most could not write, so the journal might consist of marks on a piece of wood, a scratch for each day, a circle for each full week. The keeper might glance at his journal in the morning and see by the marks that the storm was on its 5th day, or its 10th, or its 15th. The knowledge did not change the weather, but it gave him something to hold, a sense of structure a small piece of order in the middle of so much wildness. Other keepers talked to themselves. They would have long conversations out loud with no one. Some keepers gave names to objects in their tower and addressed them. The kettle on the stove had a name. The chair by the window had a name. The lamp upstairs, of course, had a name, often a very old one, sometimes the name of a saint, sometimes the name of a woman the keeper had loved long ago. To a modern listener, this might sound strange or sad, but for the keepers who did it, it was simply a way of staying inside themselves. The words kept the mind moving. The names kept the rooms feeling inhabited. A keeper who never spoke for weeks might begin to feel his own voice grow rusty, the way a hinge grows rusty when no one opens the door. So he kept it oiled, he kept it working, he spoke to the kettle. Still other keepers turned to small rituals, lighting a particular candle on a particular day, in memory of a parent who had died, eating a slightly better meal on Sundays, because Sunday was still Sunday, even out here, walking around the base of the tower once each morning, regardless of weather, to mark the boundary of the day. These rituals had no audience. No one would have known if the keeper had skipped them. But the keeper would have known. And in the long winter, when so much fell away, the small things one chose to hold on to became the architecture of the self. Let us pause here for a moment and think about the towers in particular places, because the experience of being a lighthouse keeper varied enormously depending on where the tower stood. Consider, for instance, the Tower of Hercules, which stands on the northwestern coast of Spain in what is now the province of Galicia. This tower is, in fact, much older than the medieval period. It was built by the Romans in the late 1st or early 2nd century. It has been in operation more or less continuously for nearly 2,000 years. Through the long Middle Ages, when many Roman buildings fell into ruin, the Tower of Hercules continued to burn. Local keepers, generation after generation, tended its fire. The tower stood on a high promontory, looking out over the cold Atlantic, where ships from northern Europe rounded the corner of Spain on their way down to Portugal, to the Mediterranean and beyond. It was one of the most important lights in all of Europe. The keepers of the Tower of Hercules lived in a small village at the base of the tower. Their lives were not as isolated as some, because Galicia was a populated region and the city of A Coruña grew up nearby. But their work was unrelenting. The Atlantic produced storms that could last for weeks. The tower itself, though massive, sometimes shook in the worst of the wind, and the keepers had to climb the long internal ramp, in a circular spiral all the way to the top, carrying fuel and oil, while the whole structure groaned around them. There are stories, perhaps half legend, of keepers in the deepest storms who tied themselves to the tower walls with ropes to keep from being knocked over by gusts that came in through the open lantern arches. The Tower of Hercules continued in service through every century of the Middle Ages. It saw the rise and fall of kingdoms. It saw the Vikings raid the Spanish coast and saw their longships disappear back into the north. It saw the Reconquista, the long Christian campaign against the Moorish kingdoms of the south. It saw, eventually, the first ships of the Atlantic explorations push out into open water. Through all of it, the lamp at the top of the tower burned, and the keepers, whose names are mostly lost, climbed their stairs every evening. Or consider the Hook Lighthouse, on the southeastern coast of Ireland. The current tower at Hook Head was built in the early 13th century, around the year 1210, by a Norman lord named William Marshall. Marshall was one of the great figures of his age, a knight, a regent, a man whose career stretched across the reigns of several kings. But what he wanted, on this particular stretch of coast, was a tower that would prevent ships from running aground on the dangerous reefs that surrounded the headland. Marshall entrusted the lighthouse to a small group of monks who lived in a nearby monastery. The monks took turns climbing the tower and tending the fire. The tower itself was unusually well built. Its walls were 13 feet thick at the base. It had 3 stories inside, with vaulted ceilings and a spiral staircase wide enough for 2 men to pass each other on the way up. The monks lived a quiet life. They prayed. They ate simply. They climbed the stairs each evening and lit the fire. They climbed down each morning and let it cool. And the ships of Ireland and Wales and beyond passed safely up the coast, year after year, century after century. The Hook Lighthouse is still standing today. It has in fact been in continuous operation for more than 800 years, which makes it one of the oldest working lighthouses in the world. The monks gave way eventually to lay keepers. The wood fire gave way to coal, and then to oil, and then to gas, and then to electricity. The tower itself, though, is largely unchanged. The same 13-foot walls, the same wide spiral stairs, the same view across the same grey-green Irish Sea. If you visit it now, you can climb the stairs, and you can stand in the upper room where so many medieval keepers stood. And you can look out the windows, and you can hear, exactly as they heard, the wind on the rocks below. There were many such towers scattered along the coasts of Europe. Some have survived, many have not. The towers of the eastern Mediterranean, the towers of the Baltic, the towers of the rocky French coast, the towers of the Scottish islands, the towers of the Italian shores. Each had its own particular shape, its own particular keepers, its own particular weather. And yet in their daily rhythm they were astonishingly similar. The world over, the keeper rose in the morning, slept in fragments, tended his lamp through the night, and waited for whatever the next day would bring. Let us turn now to the particular question of food and survival, because in the most isolated lighthouses, this was a constant concern. A keeper who lived on a small island, miles from the nearest village, had to plan his food supplies very carefully. He could not simply walk to a market when he ran out of something. If he ran out of flour in February, and the next supply boat was not expected until May, he would have to make do with what he had, or starve. The basic supplies were brought in by boat, usually in large batches several times a year. The supplier might arrive in the spring, when the weather first calmed, with a load of flour, salt, oil, dried beans, perhaps a few small luxuries like sugar or wine. The keeper would unload these supplies and store them in the dry rooms at the base of the tower, where the thick stone walls kept the temperature steady and the rats mostly out. Then the boat would leave, and the keeper would not see another supplier for months. Kingsdrum, the nights were short. In the high latitudes of northern Europe, summer nights might last only 5 or 6 hours of true darkness. The keeper would light the lamp late, perhaps at 9 or 10 in the evening, and let it burn until 3 or 4 in the morning, when the sky began to lighten. The watches were brief. The work was light. The weather was, more often than not, kind. The wind was warmer. The rain, when it came, was gentler. The sea was calmer. Ships moved easily up and down the coasts, carrying wool, wine, salt, fish, timber, hides. The keeper's light was needed, but it was needed less urgently. Storms were rare, wrecks were uncommon. Summer was also the season when the keeper had visitors. A nephew might come up from the village to spend a week. A travelling priest might stop by on his way to a distant parish. Fishermen, blown slightly off course, might tie up briefly on the rocks below the tower and climb up for an hour to share a meal and exchange news. The keeper, who had spent the long winter mostly alone, would suddenly find himself drawn into conversation. He might not be very good at it at first. The words might come slowly. He might forget the names of common things. But after a day or two of company, he would remember how to talk, and would talk eagerly, sometimes for hours, until his guest grew tired and excused himself to bed. In some seasons the keeper would also see travelling traders, who came along the coast in small boats, selling needles and salt and odd bits of metalwork. He would buy what he could afford. He would ask the trader for news of the wider world. The trader might tell him about a war in a distant country, or about a king who had died, or about a new style of building that was spreading across the cities. The keeper would listen without much reaction. The wider world, to him, was a kind of rumour. He had not seen most of it. He would not see most of it. But he liked knowing that it was still there, churning along, while he sat in his stone tower with his small flame. Winter, of course, was different. Winter was the season the keeper truly earned his keep. The nights were long, in some places lasting 14, 15, 16 hours of darkness. The storms came down out of the north, or up from the southwest, depending on the region. The wind would scream against the tower walls for days on end, until the keeper grew so used to it that the rare moments of silence felt strange, even unnerving. The sea would rise. Waves would crash against the rocks below, sending spray so high that in some lighthouses the salt water reached the lantern room itself, pattering against the windows like cold rain. The keeper in winter lit his lamp early and let it burn long. He climbed the stairs more often, to check the windows for cracks, to wipe away the salt and the spray, to make sure the lamp had not been blown into an odd angle by the gusts that found their way through cracks in the walls. He carried more fuel because the lamp burned more, and because he himself needed a small fire in his quarters below just to keep from freezing. He wore layers of wool. He wore a thick cap pulled down over his ears. He wore mittens even indoors, because the stone of the tower walls grew so cold to the touch that bare hands ached after a few minutes. In the harshest winters, the keeper might not see another human being for weeks at a time. The path to the village would be impassable. The fishing boats would not come. Even the seagulls, in the worst weather, would vanish, finding shelter in the cliffs. The keeper would be alone with the sound of the wind and the sound of the sea, and his own slow movements through the small rooms of his stone home. He would sleep when he could. He would eat what he had. He would tend the lamp. It was in winter that the keeper's psychological strength was most tested. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes when the weather has cut you off from everyone you know, and you do not know when the cutting off will end. It is not the loneliness of a single quiet evening. It is the loneliness of looking out the window in the morning, seeing the storm still raging, seeing the path still buried, and realizing that today, again, no one will come, and then doing the same thing tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Many keepers developed, over the years, small habits that helped them through these long winter stretches. Some kept a journal of sorts, though most could not write, so the journal might consist of marks on a piece of wood, a scratch for each day, a circle for each full week. The keeper might glance at his journal in the morning and see, by the marks, that the storm was on its 5th day, or its 10th, or its 15th. The knowledge did not change the weather, but it gave him something to hold, a sense of structure, a small piece of order in the middle of so much wildness. Other keepers talked to themselves. They would have long conversations, out loud, with no one. Some keepers gave names to objects in their tower, and addressed them. The kettle on the stove had a name. The chair by the window had a name. The lamp upstairs, of course, had a name, often a very old one. Sometimes the name of a saint, sometimes the name of a woman the keeper had loved long ago. To a modern listener, this might sound strange or sad, but for the keepers who did it, it was simply a way of staying inside themselves. The words kept the mind moving. The names kept the rooms feeling inhabited. A keeper who never spoke for weeks might begin to feel his own voice grow rusty, the way a hinge grows rusty when no one opens the door. So he kept it oiled. He kept it working. He spoke to the kettle. Still other keepers turned to small rituals, lighting a particular candle on a particular day in memory of a parent who had died, eating a slightly better meal on Sundays because Sunday was still Sunday, even out here, walking around the base of the tower once each morning, regardless of weather, to mark the boundary of the day. These rituals had no audience. No one would have known if the keeper had skipped them. But the keeper would have known. And in the long winter, when so much fell away, the small things one chose to hold on to became the architecture of the self. Let us pause here for a moment and think about the towers in particular places, because the experience of being a lighthouse keeper varied enormously depending on where the tower stood. Consider, for instance, the Tower of Hercules, which stands on the northwestern coast of Spain, in what is now the province of Galicia. This tower is in fact much older than the medieval period. It was built by the Romans in the late 1st or early 2nd century. It has been in operation more or less continuously for nearly 2,000 years. Through the long Middle Ages, when many Roman buildings fell into ruin, the Tower of Hercules continued to burn. Local keepers, generation after generation, tended its fire. The tower stood on a high promontory, looking out over the cold Atlantic, where ships from northern Europe rounded the corner of Spain on their way down to Portugal, to the Mediterranean and beyond. It was one of the most important lights in all of Europe. The keepers of the Tower of Hercules lived in a small village at the base of the tower. Their lives were not as isolated as some, because Galicia was a populated region and the city of A Coruña grew up nearby. But their work was unrelenting. The Atlantic produced storms that could last for weeks. The tower itself, though massive, sometimes shook in the worst of the wind, and the keepers had to climb the long internal ramp in a circular spiral all the way to the top, carrying fuel and oil, while the whole structure groaned around them. There are stories, perhaps half legend, of keepers in the deepest storms who tied themselves to the tower walls with ropes to keep from being knocked over by gusts that came in through the open lantern arches. The Tower of Hercules continued in service through every century of the Middle Ages. It saw the rise and fall of kingdoms. It saw the Vikings raid the Spanish coast and saw their longships disappear back into the north. It saw the Reconquista, the long Christian campaign against the Moorish kingdoms of the south. It saw, eventually, the first ships of the Atlantic explorations push out into open water. Through all of it, the lamp at the top of the tower burned, and the keepers, whose names are mostly lost, climbed their stairs every evening. Or consider the Hook Lighthouse on the southeastern coast of Ireland. The current tower at Hook Head was built in the early 13th century, around the year 1210, by a Norman lord named William Marshall. Marshall was one of the great figures of his age, a knight, a regent, a man whose career stretched across the reigns of several kings. But what he wanted, on this particular stretch of coast, was a tower that would prevent ships from running aground on the dangerous reefs that surrounded the headland. Marshall entrusted the lighthouse to a small group of monks who lived in a nearby monastery. The monks took turns climbing the tower and tending the fire. The tower itself was unusually well built. Its walls were 13 feet thick at the base. It had 3 stories inside, with vaulted ceilings and a spiral staircase wide enough for 2 men to pass each other on the way up. The monks lived a quiet life. They prayed. They ate simply. They climbed the stairs each evening and lit the fire. They climbed down each morning and let it cool. And the ships of Ireland and Wales and beyond passed safely up the coast, year after year, century after century. The Hook Lighthouse is still standing today. It has in fact been in continuous operation for more than 800 years, which makes it one of the oldest working lighthouses in the world. The monks gave way, eventually, to lay keepers. The wood fire gave way to coal, and then to oil, and then to gas, and then to electricity. The tower itself, though, is largely unchanged. The same 13-foot walls, the same wide spiral stairs, the same view across the same grey-green Irish Sea. If you visit it now, you can climb the stairs, and you can stand in the upper room where so many medieval keepers stood, and you can look out the windows, and you can hear, exactly as they heard, the wind on the rocks below. There were many such towers scattered along the coasts of Europe. Some have survived, many have not. The towers of the eastern Mediterranean, the towers of the Baltic, the towers of the rocky French coast, the towers of the Scottish islands, the towers of the Italian shores. Each had its own particular shape, its own particular keepers, its own particular weather, and yet in their daily rhythm they were astonishingly similar. The world over, the keeper rose in the morning, slept in fragments, tended his lamp through the night, and waited for whatever the next day would bring. Let us turn now to the particular question of food and survival, because in the most isolated lighthouses this was a constant concern. The keeper who lived on a small island, miles from the nearest village, had to plan his food supplies very carefully. He could not simply walk to a market when he ran out of something. If he ran out of flour in February, and the next supply boat was not expected until May, he would have to make do with what he had, or starve. The basic supplies were brought in by boat, usually in large batches several times a year. The supplier might arrive in the spring, when the weather first calmed, with a load of flour, salt, oil, dried beans, perhaps a few small luxuries like sugar or wine. The keeper would unload these supplies and store them in the dry rooms at the base of the tower, where the thick stone walls kept the temperature steady, and the rats mostly out. Then the boat would leave, and the keeper would not see another supplier for months. He had to make his supplies last. He kept careful track, in his head or on a piece of wood, of how much flour he was using each week. He rationed himself. He ate less when he was alone. He saved the better food, the salted pork, the dried fruit, for special occasions or for emergencies. If a fellow keeper became ill, the rationed food might be needed. If a stranger arrived from a wreck, the food might be needed. The keeper was, in a sense, the steward of a small floating economy. His decisions about food were not just personal, they were structural. To supplement his stored supplies, the keeper fished. Almost every coastal keeper fished. He kept lines in the water during the day, weighted with stones, baited with whatever scraps he had. He pulled in mackerel, herring, small flatfish, eels, the occasional cod. He cleaned them at a small bench by the rocks, threw the entrails to the seagulls, and either ate the fish fresh or hung the cleaned bodies to dry in the wind. Dried fish, salted and stored carefully, could last for months. In some lighthouses, the rafters of the lower rooms were strung with rows of drying fish, like brown leather pendants, slowly hardening as the months went on. He also gathered shellfish when the tide allowed. Limpets, periwinkles, mussels, clams. These were collected from the rocks at low tide, often early in the morning, before the seabirds got to them. The keeper would walk the wet stones with a small iron pry, knocking the shells loose, dropping them into a bucket. He would carry them back to the tower, boil them in seawater on his small stove, and eat them with bread. It was not a glamorous meal, but it was free, and it was reliable, and on the days when nothing else was working, it was enough. In some regions, the keeper also gathered seabird eggs, particularly in spring. Many lighthouses stood on rocks or islands where seabirds nested by the thousands. The keeper, climbing carefully along the cliffs, could collect dozens of eggs in a morning. These were eaten boiled, or fried, or preserved in lime for later use. The taste was strong and slightly fishy, because the parent birds had eaten so much fish. But to a hungry keeper, fishiness was not a problem. It was a meal. A few keepers kept small livestock, a goat or two perhaps for milk, a handful of chickens for eggs. In a few cases, even a small pig, fattened on table scraps and slaughtered in autumn. The animals required care. They needed shelter from the worst of the weather. They needed feed, which the keeper had to either grow or buy. But they paid him back in steady small amounts of food, every day, for years. A keeper with a goat had milk every morning. A keeper with 3 chickens had several eggs a week. These were not luxuries. They were the difference between a life that felt sustainable and a life that felt like waiting for the next boat. Vegetables, as we said, came from the small garden. The lighthouse garden was always a struggle. The soil on a windy headland is thin. The salt in the air burns young leaves. The wind itself can flatten a row of plants in a single bad afternoon. Keepers learnt to build small, low walls of stone around their gardens to shelter the plants. They learnt to plant hardy varieties: cabbage, kale, turnips, leeks, sometimes a few rows of onions. They learnt to harvest at the right moment before a storm could ruin a crop. They learnt to store what they could not eat right away. Cabbages were piled in cool, dark rooms. Turnips were buried in sand. Onions were braided and hung from the rafters next to the dried fish. Bread was a separate problem. Some lighthouses had small ovens where the keeper could bake his own bread once a week or so. Others did not, and the keeper relied on bread brought in from the village, which would harden and stale within days. In those cases, the keeper would soak the hard bread in soup, or in beer, or in milk, to make it edible again. Stale bread, soaked and softened, was a daily reality for many keepers. The texture was not pleasant, but the calories were the same. In the worst of times, when supplies ran low, the keeper would simply eat less. He would skip meals. He would draw from his fat stores. He would grow thinner over the winter, his cheeks hollowing out, his belt tightening. When spring came and the first supply boat arrived, he would eat his way back to health, slowly, through several weeks of slightly larger meals. This cycle of leanness in winter and recovery in spring was familiar to almost every medieval keeper. It was familiar to many medieval peasants as well. Hunger, in the medieval world, was not a strange visitor. It was a frequent guest, and one learnt to host it without complaint. Health, in such conditions, was always a concern. A keeper who fell seriously ill had few options. There was no doctor. There was no medicine, except for whatever herbs he had on hand, and whatever folk remedies he remembered from his village. A bad fever could kill him before anyone knew he was sick. A broken leg, suffered alone, could leave him crawling across the stone floor for days, unable to climb the stairs, unable to light the lamp, unable even to signal for help. This was, in many ways, the deepest fear of the medieval keeper. Not loneliness, not storms, not even death, exactly, but the possibility of becoming helpless, alone, with the lamp going dark above him, and ships sailing into the rocks because of his sickness. Some keepers, when they felt themselves growing unwell, would push themselves to extraordinary lengths to keep working. They would climb the stairs with a fever burning in their joints. They would tend the wick with hands shaking from cold. They would sit by the lamp, wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching the flame, willing themselves not to faint. There are stories, preserved in old records, of keepers who died at their posts. A keeper found at dawn slumped over a chair in the lantern room, the lamp still burning beside him. A keeper found in his bed, having lit the lamp the night before, and then collapsed coming back down the stairs. A keeper whose body was discovered weeks after his death by a supply boat that had been delayed by storms. The lamp, in some of these accounts, had gone out long before. In others, by some unlikely chance, it had continued to burn for hours after the keeper's death, until its oil finally ran dry. These were rare events, but they were known, and they shaped the way other keepers thought about their work. The keeper understood that his job was, in some real sense, more important than his life. If he died, the light should still go on burning for as long as possible. He filled the reservoir to its top. He left clean wicks beside the lamp. He arranged things so that, in his absence, the system would carry on for as long as it could without him. This was not a morbid practice, it was a professional one. A keeper who did not prepare for his own absence was not a good keeper. Now, what about the family lighthouses we mentioned earlier? Let us spend some time on those, because the texture of life was rather different when a keeper had his wife and children with him. In family lighthouses, the work was shared in a way that solo keepers could only imagine. The wife was, in nearly all cases, an unofficial co-keeper. She might not climb the stairs at night herself, though many wives did, but she would handle nearly everything else. She would manage the household. She would cook. She would mend clothes. She would tend the garden. She would carry messages to the village. She would teach the children. She would even, on occasion, take over the lamp herself when her husband was sick or away or simply too tired to climb the stairs one more time. The children of lighthouse keepers grew up in a strange and beautiful world. They knew the sound of the sea before they knew the sound of human crowds. They knew the names of the gulls. They knew which rocks were safe to climb on and which were treacherous. They knew the rhythm of the tides. They learned to walk barefoot on wet stone without slipping. They learned to swim often by necessity because they lived on the edge of deep water and falling in was a real possibility. They also learnt the work. By the age of 7 or 8, a lighthouse child might be carrying small loads of fuel up the stairs. By 12, the child might be cleaning the lamp and trimming the wick. By 15, the child might be taking watches on his or her own, allowing the parents to sleep. In some families, the role of keeper passed from father to son for generations. A boy who grew up in a lighthouse would, in time, take over from his father, and his own children would grow up in the same stone walls. Such dynasties of keepers were common in many regions, and they produced an extraordinary depth of local knowledge. A keeper whose family had tended a particular tower for 4 generations knew every rock, every current, every wind shift, every storm pattern, every kind of bird, every kind of fish, every shape of cloud. He had inherited the place the way a farmer inherits a field, except that his field was the sea. The children, though, did not always stay. Many of them, growing up in the isolation of the lighthouse, came to long for the wider world. They would leave, in their late teens or early 20s, to seek work in the cities, or to go to sea themselves, or to marry villagers and settle down in the more ordinary rhythm of inland life. The parents, watching them go, often felt the loss deeply, but did not begrudge it. The lighthouse, they knew, was not for everyone. A life that fit one person could break another. Some lighthouse children remembered their childhood with a kind of slow nostalgia. They remembered the long summer evenings when the family sat together outside the tower, watching the sun set over the sea. They remembered the storms, less as terrors and more as great natural events, like enormous animals that came roaring past the tower and then moved on. They remembered the visits of the supply boat, which were the most exciting days of the year, full of new faces, new news, fresh food, small gifts brought by sailors who had grown fond of the keeper's family. They remembered, most of all, the steady rhythm of the lamp, the lighting in the evening, the extinguishing at dawn, the light that, all through their childhood, had been the most reliable thing in the world. For those children, the lamp became a kind of inner compass, even after they had left the lighthouse, even after they had moved to cities and lived ordinary lives. The lamp continued to burn somewhere in the back of their minds. They would remember it in moments of stillness. They would think of their father climbing the stairs. They would think of their mother humming in the kitchen below. They would think of the small flame at the top of the tower, sending its light out across the dark water. And they would feel, for a moment, that the world was a calmer and more ordered place than it usually seemed. This is, perhaps, one of the gifts the lighthouse gave to those who lived in it. A sense of purpose so simple and so steady that it did not need to be explained. The light went on, the light went off, the ships passed safely, that was all. Let us drift now to a different aspect of the keeper's life, which is the question of weather, and what weather really meant to him. For most modern people, weather is a matter of comfort. A rainy day means you might want an umbrella. A cold day means you might want a coat. A windy day means your hair will be unruly. The weather is, generally, a backdrop. It does not threaten you. It does not change the structure of your day. For the medieval lighthouse keeper, weather was everything. It was not a backdrop. It was the central character of his life. He woke up thinking about the weather. He went to bed thinking about the weather. He spent long stretches of each day reading the weather by looking at the sky, the sea, the way smoke from his small fire rose or did not rise, the way the gulls flew, the way the air smelled. He learned to predict the weather by signs that no modern instrument could measure. A particular shade of pink in the dawn sky meant a storm by evening. A particular smell on the wind, faintly metallic, meant rain within the hour. A particular kind of cloud, low and rolling, meant wind from the northwest, which on his coast meant the dangerous reefs to the southeast would be lit by spray. A particular silence among the seabirds, in the middle of a sunny afternoon, meant something coming that they could feel, but the keeper could not yet see. This kind of knowledge cannot be learnt from a book. It is learned only by spending years and years in the same place, watching the same sky over the same water, until the patterns reveal themselves slowly, the way the design of a complicated woven cloth reveals itself only when you have looked at it for a very long time. Most keepers, after 20 or 30 years in a single tower, could predict the weather with an accuracy that would astonish a modern meteorologist. They were not better at science, they were better at attention. They had given thousands of hours of careful watching to a single small piece of sky, and the sky had eventually told them most of what it was going to do. When a storm did come, the keeper's life narrowed dramatically. The storm was, in many ways, the truest version of his work. Everything that came before was preparation. The storm was the test. He would light the lamp early, because the sky was already dark. He would climb the stairs more often to check that the windows were holding. He would feel the tower itself shifting slightly under the force of the wind, the great mass of stone leaning, just a fraction, in the direction the wind was pushing. He would hear the gale through the cracks in the walls, a long continuous howl that rose and fell but never stopped. The sea below would smash against the rocks with sounds like cannon fire, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The keeper, during a storm, did not sleep. Or rather, he slept in even smaller fragments than usual. 20 minutes here, a quarter of an hour there. He would doze in his chair beside the lamp, his head nodding forward, then jerk awake at some change in the wind, and check the flame, and go to the window, and look out at the chaos, and listen for ships. Ships, in such weather, were sometimes audible. Even over the roar of the storm, a desperate captain might fire a cannon as a signal of distress. The keeper would hear the dull thud, and know that, somewhere out there in the wind, a vessel was in trouble. There was nothing he could do except keep his light burning brightly. If the captain could see the light, he might be able to steer wide of the rocks. If he could not, the cannon fire would soon be followed by silence, and the keeper would know what had happened, even if he could not see it. In the worst storms, ships came close enough to the rocks that the keeper could hear them break apart. The sound of a wooden hull cracking on stone is unmistakable. It is a deep, splintering crash, followed by the chaos of waves rushing over the wreck. The keeper would hear it. He would close his eyes for a moment. He would say a prayer for the sailors. And then he would keep his light burning, because there might be another ship coming, and that one might still be saved. Humby. In the morning, after the storm, the keeper would walk down to the rocks. He would look at the wreckage. Sometimes there were survivors, clinging to broken timbers, half drowned, half frozen. The keeper would bring them up to the tower, wrap them in blankets, give them hot soup, and care for them until they were strong enough to make their way home. Sometimes there were no survivors. The keeper would simply gather what bodies he could find, drag them above the tide line, and send word to the village so that the proper burials could be arranged. He would not weep openly. He had learned, long ago, that the work did not allow for that kind of grief. He would simply do what needed to be done, and then go back up the stairs. This is one of the heaviest aspects of the keeper's life, and it is something modern people sometimes fail to understand. The keeper was not in a position to save everyone. He was, in fact, in a position to save very few people, in any direct sense. Most of his saving was indirect. It was the cumulative effect of a light that burned every night for 40 years. The ships that did not crash, the crews that did not die, the widows that were not made. These were the keeper's true accomplishments, and they were invisible. He could not point to them. He could not count them. He could only trust that they existed in some other version of reality that ran parallel to his own, where the ships had crashed and the men had drowned, but for him. This is, in its way, a deeply philosophical position. The keeper lived inside a story whose meaning he could not see. He performed actions whose consequences he could not measure. He worked, year after year, for outcomes he could only imagine. And somehow, most keepers learned to be at peace with this. They did not need the confirmation. They did not need the gratitude. They simply did the work, and trusted the work. There is something restful about thinking of them in this light, their patience, their steadiness, their willingness to live inside a small, repeating routine for the sake of strangers they would never meet. The world today often seems to demand constant feedback. Every effort wants to be measured. Every kindness wants to be recorded. The lighthouse keeper would not have understood that. He would have nodded politely and gone back up to trim his wick. Let us think now about the longer arc of a keeper's career, because the keeper, like any person, changed across the decades. When a young man first took up the post, he was often eager. He had heard stories of the work. He imagined the silence as something noble. He imagined himself as a quiet hero, sitting beside his lamp, saving ships. His first few years in the lighthouse were full of small discoveries. The way the stairs felt different in summer and winter, the way the lamp burned slightly brighter when the wind was from the east, the way the gulls returned in March and left in October, and what their cries sounded like in between. But the young keeper also struggled. The first winter, in particular, was hard. The cold was deeper than he had expected. The loneliness was thicker. The nights were longer than any nights he had ever spent. He would sit beside the lamp at 3 in the morning and feel, very suddenly, that he could not do this, that he had made a mistake, that he should have stayed in his village, married the baker's daughter, taken up some ordinary trade, lived a life with neighbours and noise. The thought would hit him hard, and then it would pass, and he would tend the lamp, and the dawn would come, and he would feel, in the morning light, that perhaps it was not so bad. These early struggles were, for most keepers, the worst of the work. If a man could survive his first 3 winters, he was almost always going to make it as a keeper. Something settled in him during those first years. The loneliness stopped being a wound, and became a kind of room he lived in, comfortably enough. The cold stopped being a punishment, and became a season he simply put on, like a coat. The long nights stopped being something to endure, and became something to inhabit. He grew into the work the way a young tree grows into a particular shape of wind, bending in the same direction over and over again, until the bend itself becomes the tree. The middle years of a keeper's life were often his best. He had grown competent. He knew his lamp inside and out. He knew his weather. He knew his coast. He had developed routines that suited him. He had made peace, mostly, with the long nights. He might have a wife and children by now, or he might be confirmed in his bachelorhood. But either way, the loneliness no longer pressed on him the way it had in the early years. He had become, in some sense, a man of the lighthouse. The tower was no longer just where he worked. It was who he was. He had also, by this point, accumulated stories. Stories of storms he had ridden out. Stories of ships he had watched pass safely in the worst weather. Stories of wrecks he had witnessed. Stories of strange travellers who had stopped at his tower for a meal. Stories of unusual lights he had seen on the water, lights that he could not explain, that some attributed to ghost ships and others to swamp gas or floating phosphorescence. He did not tell these stories often. He had few listeners, but he kept them in his head, like coins in a pocket, and on the rare evenings when a guest sat by his fire, he would pull them out, one or two at a time, and lay them on the table. By the later years of his career, the keeper had often outlived most of his contemporaries. The men he had grown up with in the village were dying off, one by one. His parents had long since died. His siblings, if he had any, were old themselves. The world he remembered as a boy had largely vanished. The villagers who came up to trade with him were strangers. The faces at the harbour, when he visited, were unfamiliar. He had become, in a sense, a relic, a man from an earlier time, a man who remembered things no one else remembered, who knew the names of people no one else recognized, who had stories that had no audience, but he still had the lamp. The lamp did not care that he was old. The lamp did not care that his back hurt as he climbed the stairs. The lamp did not care that his hands shook a little in the cold as he trimmed the wick. The lamp simply needed to be lit, and the keeper still knew how to light it. So he climbed the stairs, slowly now, and he lit the flame, and he sat down beside it. And the night passed, as it had always passed, and the dawn came, and he was still there. Eventually, of course, every keeper grew too old for the work. Some retired into the village, where they were given small cottages and modest pensions. Others, having no place to go, stayed in the lighthouse and were assisted by younger keepers who took over the heavier duties. A few, fortunate in their families, lived out their last years among their grown children, surrounded by grandchildren who liked to climb up to the lantern room and look out the windows and ask questions about the old days. When a keeper died, the lamp was passed to another. The work continued. The tower stood. The light, that small steady light that had been burning at the top of the tower for so many years, went on burning. New eyes watched it. New hands trimmed its wick. The ships, far out on the dark water, continued to find their way home. This is perhaps what makes the medieval lighthouse keeper such a quietly remarkable figure. He was not in any individual sense indispensable. There were always other keepers, other hands, other watches, but the role itself, the role of the keeper, was indispensable. As long as someone kept the lamp burning, ships were safer. And someone always did. For century after century, in tower after tower, along coast after coast, someone always did. Let us drift now into the smaller details, the textures of the keeper's life that rarely appear in history books, but that defined his days. Consider, for instance, the matter of light itself in his private life. We have talked about the great lamp at the top of the tower, but the keeper, in his living quarters below, used much smaller lights to see by. A single clay lamp, fueled by a tiny amount of oil, gave him just enough light to move around his rooms without bumping into the furniture. The light was orange and unsteady. It cast huge wavering shadows on the stone walls. The keeper's own shadow, on the wall behind him, might loom up the height of the room and dance with every flicker of the flame. The keeper grew used to this kind of light. He grew used to seeing the world dimly. He grew used to the fact that, in winter, when he woke before dawn, his rooms were almost entirely dark, and he had to feel his way to the small lamp on the table and strike the flint and coax the wick alight before he could begin his day. He grew used to going to bed in a darkness so complete that, even with his eyes open, he could not tell whether he was facing the ceiling or the wall. When the moon was full, the keeper's rooms were sometimes flooded with a soft silver light that came through the small windows. This light the keeper found beautiful. He would sometimes sit in it late at night without lighting his lamp, and let his eyes adjust until he could see the whole room in moonlight. The pewter cup on the table, the fold of the blanket on the chair, the pale square of the window where the light came in. It was a more delicate world than the one his oil lamp showed him. He liked it. When the moon was new, the darkness was so total that, going to bed, the keeper would close his eyes and find that the inside of his eyelids looked the same as the outside. There was no difference. The room was no brighter than his closed eyes. This kind of darkness, which modern people almost never experience, was simply part of his life. He had grown up in it. He had aged into it. He did not find it strange. Consider also the matter of sound, because the keeper's ears were perhaps the most important part of him. We have already mentioned the sound of the sea, and the sound of the wind, and the sound of the seagulls. But there were many other sounds in the keeper's life, and he learned each of them. The sound of his own footsteps on the stone stairs. Each step had its own small note. He could climb the stairs in total darkness, and know, by sound alone, exactly where he was. The sound of the lamp burning. A well-tended lamp made a small, steady hiss, almost too faint to hear. If the hiss grew louder, the wick was getting long and needed trimming. If the hiss faltered, the oil was running low. The keeper could be down in his quarters, 3 stories below, and still hear the change in his lamp, if his ears were sharp enough. The sound of weather approaching. We have spoken of the smells and the looks of weather, but it also had sounds. The distant rumble of thunder, miles out at sea. The faint hum of wind picking up against far rocks. The slow ringing of certain bells along the coast that responded to particular kinds of wind. Each region had its own sound vocabulary. Each keeper learned his regions, the sound of his own breathing. In the deepest silences, when no other sound was happening, the keeper could hear himself breathing. He could hear his own heartbeat, sometimes in his ears. He learned not to be afraid of this. In the modern world, we surround ourselves with so much noise that we rarely hear our own bodies. The keeper heard his constantly. He came to know the small irregular sounds of his own life, the way a sailor knows the creaking of his own boat. They were familiar. They were comforting. They told him he was still alive. Consider also the seasons of his sleep. In summer, when the nights were short, the keeper might sleep mainly in the morning, after the lamp had gone out. He would lie down in his small bed, with the warm summer sun beginning to come in through the window, and let himself drift into a deep, satisfied sleep. He might sleep until midday. He might wake refreshed, ready to do the lighter work of the long afternoon, then take another short nap before dusk, then begin his evening watch with a clear head. In winter, the schedule was reversed and harder. The keeper might sleep in fragments through the long night, dozing between watches, never quite letting himself fall fully asleep, in case the lamp needed something. He might then sleep again in the late morning, after the light was out, and again in the afternoon, in short pieces. The cumulative sleep in winter was less than in summer. The keeper was, in a sense, always slightly tired through the winter months. He learnt to function in this condition. He learnt to move slowly, to think slowly, to avoid sudden decisions, to give his body time to do what it could. The keeper's sleep was almost always lighter than the sleep of an ordinary person. He learnt to wake at small sounds. a shift in the wind, a change in the rhythm of the waves, the cry of a particular seabird that meant first light. He could not afford to sleep deeply, because the lamp might need him at any moment. So he slept like a deer in a forest, just under the surface of wakefulness, ready to rise at any provocation. This style of sleep, surprisingly, did not exhaust him. Over time, the body adjusts to its own patterns. A man who has spent 20 years sleeping in fragments will find that fragments are enough. He will feel rested in his own way. He will not envy the deep 8-hour sleeps of villagers, because he has never had them and does not know what he is missing. His sleep is his sleep, and it suits the shape of his life. Many keepers in old age found that they could no longer sleep in long blocks even when they were free to. After retirement, they would wake several times each night, automatically, and look toward the window to check on a lamp that was no longer their responsibility. The habit had gone too deep. The body remembered. They would lie in their retirement cottages in the village, listening to the distant sound of the sea, and feel sometimes that they had left something important behind. They had left their lamp, they had left their work, they had left their tower, and though they were warm and safe and surrounded by neighbours, a small part of them was still climbing the stairs every evening in their dreams. Let us drift further now into the matter of the lighthouse itself as a place, the architecture, the rooms, the slow shape of its days. The base of the tower, in most medieval lighthouses, was a thick-walled chamber that served as the keeper's main living space. It might be a single room, or it might be divided into 2 or 3 smaller rooms by interior walls. There was usually a fireplace set into one of the walls, where the keeper cooked his meals and warmed himself in winter. The fireplace might be small, just large enough for a single iron pot, or it might be larger, with a small bread oven built into one side. The flue rose up through the wall and out the top of the tower, well away from the main lantern flame. The floor was stone, often covered with rushes or straw in winter for warmth, and swept clean in summer. The keeper's bed was a wooden frame with a mattress of straw or seaweed, sometimes covered with sheepskins. The bed was usually placed against an interior wall to keep the keeper as far as possible from the cold of the outer stones. The blankets were thick wool, often homemade, often passed down. A keeper might sleep under blankets his mother had woven 30 years before. The furniture was simple: a wooden table, a few stools or chairs, a chest for storing clothes and small valuables, a shelf or 2 for plates, cups, and the small handful of personal possessions a keeper might own. A keeper's possessions were typically very few: a change of clothes, a second pair of boots kept dry for emergencies, a knife, a flint and steel, a small wooden box of treasured items, perhaps a letter from a long-dead parent, perhaps a curl of hair, perhaps a pebble picked up on a particular beach long ago. The middle level of the tower, in many lighthouses, served as a storage and workshop space. Here the keeper kept his fuel, his tools, his spare equipment, the barrels of oil, the bundles of wicks, the cans of polishing materials. Here he might also do small repair work, mending nets, sharpening tools, patching clothes. The middle level often had a small window, looking out to sea, through which the keeper could glance while he worked. The top level, of course, was the lantern room. This was the highest, most exposed, most weather-beaten part of the tower. In summer it was bright and pleasant. In winter it could be brutal, with wind whistling through every crack and frost forming on the inside of the windows. The keeper spent more of his life in this room than in any other, even though he was only there at night. The hours of his watch added up. Over a lifetime, the keeper had spent more time in the lantern room than in any single room of his childhood home. It was his true dwelling in some sense. It was the room he knew best. Around the tower, outside, there were usually a few smaller buildings, a small shed for tools, a small stable if there was a goat or a pony, a cistern for collecting rainwater, a small wooden privy, a garden if the wind allowed, sometimes a chicken coop sheltered behind a wall, sometimes a small chapel, especially in monastery lighthouses where the keeper and his guests could pray. The whole compound was usually quite compact, occupying perhaps half an acre on the rocks, ringed by a low stone wall to keep out the worst of the wind and the occasional wandering livestock from a distant farm. Outside the wall was the rest of the world, the path to the village, the cliff edge, the rocks, the sea. The keeper, after years in such a place, came to know the boundaries of his small kingdom intimately. He knew the exact stone where the wall began to slope downward toward the cliff. He knew the spot on the path where the wind always seemed to gather, and where, on stormy days, he had to lean into it just to keep walking. He knew the particular gull that nested every spring on the corner of the lantern room roof, and her offspring, and her offspring's offspring, going back through generations of gulls and matched generations of keepers. This intimacy with a small place is something modern life rarely allows. We move so much. We change cities, change apartments, change neighborhoods. The keeper did not move. He stayed. He grew slowly into his place, the way a tree grows slowly into its soil. After 30 or 40 years, he was, in some real sense, a feature of the place. The lighthouse and the keeper were not separate. They were one continuous thing. When a stranger arrived, perhaps a new young keeper sent to learn the trade, the old keeper would show him around. He would point at things, the path, the cistern, the garden, the stairs. He would name them in a way that suggested they were old friends, not just objects. The young keeper would nod politely and try to remember everything, knowing that he could not possibly absorb in a few days what the old keeper had taken decades to learn. The old keeper, for his part, would feel a small sadness at the thought that the young man would never fully understand. The young keeper would learn the work in time. He would do his own watches, he would tend his own lamp, but the layers of meaning the old keeper had laid down over the years, the memories attached to particular stones, the knowledge of which afternoons in May the sun struck the lantern room at a certain angle, the small private rituals that no one would ever inherit, these would be lost when the old keeper finally went. The new keeper would build his own layers, of course, over his own decades, but the old layers would dissolve back into the stone, the way mist dissolves into a morning, leaving nothing behind that could be pointed at, but having shaped everything in a way that the place still quietly remembered. This is one of the gentle melancholies of the lighthouse life. It is also one of its gifts, to live so fully in a single place that the place absorbs you. To leave behind not a name carved in stone, but a presence that is soaked into the stone itself. The medieval keepers, whose names are mostly lost to history, are still there in some quiet way, in the towers that still stand. The wear on the steps, the polish on the railings, the angle at which the door of the lantern room sits, slightly crooked because every keeper for hundreds of years opened it with the same shoulder. These are the keepers, lingering on, long after their bodies have gone. Let us drift toward the close now, slowly, the way the keeper would drift toward dawn in the long final hours of his watch. The dawn in the keeper's life was always the same and always different. The light came up over the eastern horizon, or, on some coasts, over the inland hills. The sky went from black to deep blue to grey to faintly orange. The seabirds began their morning calls. The sea, which had been mostly invisible, gradually showed itself again, sometimes calm and silver, sometimes still churning from the night's wind. The world, hidden for hours, was returned. The keeper would watch the dawn come. He would not need to do anything yet. The lamp was still burning, but the daylight was beginning to make it unnecessary. He would simply sit and watch the morning happen. Some keepers said this was the best part of their day. The night's work was done. The dawn was beautiful. The body, tired but satisfied, knew that rest was coming. The keeper would lean back in his chair and let the light flood into the lantern room. And for a few minutes he would be the most peaceful man in the world. When the sun was fully up, he would rise from his chair, stretch his stiff back, walk slowly to the lamp, and put out the flame. The wick would smoulder for a moment, sending up a thin curl of smoke, and then go cold. The keeper would replace the cover. He would step back. He would look at the now dark lamp, and feel briefly the strange contrast between a fire that has been burning for hours and the silence that follows immediately when it goes out. The room, which had been alive with light, would suddenly seem ordinary again. Just a small stone chamber, just an iron lamp, just the windows looking out at the grey-blue sea. The keeper would descend the stairs, slowly, his hand on the wall for balance. He would reach the bottom. He would walk to his small bed. He would take off his boots. He would lie down, and he would sleep. In sleep the keeper would dream, sometimes, of the sea. He would dream that he was walking on water, or that he was a ship himself, or that he could see, from a great height, all the lighthouses of the world burning at the same time, like a long line of stars laid out along the coasts. The dreams were not frightening. They were the slow, patient dreams of a man whose life had been spent paying attention to one thing for so long, that the thing had become him. He would wake in the early afternoon. He would eat his bread. He would tend his garden. He would gather his shellfish. He would do the small chores of the day. He would prepare for the evening. He would climb the stairs at dusk. He would light the lamp, and the night would begin again. Multiply this rhythm by 1,000 nights, and you have a few years of a keeper's life. Multiply it by 10,000 nights, and you have his whole career. Multiply it by all the nights of all the keepers in all the towers across all the medieval centuries, and you have a vast, gentle web of small flames spread out along the coasts of Europe, burning steadily in the dark, generation after generation, while the rest of human history rose and fell in louder, more dramatic shapes inland. The kings rose and fell. The wars were fought and ended. The cathedrals were built. The cities grew. The plagues came and went. The languages shifted. The maps changed. The faiths divided and reformed. The fashions in clothing changed 3 or 4 times. The very calendar was revised. Through all of it, the lighthouse keepers climbed their stairs each evening and lit their lamps. They did not stop. They did not falter. They did not, in their own small towers, particularly notice most of the history that swept past them inland. Their history was the sea. Their kings were the storms. Their wars were the long battles between rock and tide. Their cathedrals were the towers themselves. Their faith was the daily devotion of keeping a small flame alive against the dark. And on the rare nights when a ship passed by safely, and the captain on the deck of that ship looked up at the distant point of light and felt his heart settle in his chest, the keeper in his lantern room would feel nothing, because he could not see the ship, could not hear it, did not even know it was there. He would simply be sitting beside his lamp, perhaps half dozing, perhaps whittling a piece of wood, perhaps watching the wick. He would have no idea, in that moment, that he had done his work. He would just be there, doing it. This is the deepest gift the medieval lighthouse keepers give us, looking back from across so many centuries. They show us a kind of life that does not need to be witnessed to be meaningful. They show us a kind of patience that does not demand reward. They show us a way of being alive that consists simply of doing one small useful thing, faithfully, for a very long time, while the world rolls on around you. If you are still listening, you can let yourself rest now. The lamp at the top of the tower is burning. The keeper is at his post. The ships are passing safely in the dark. Nothing in the world needs you to do anything more tonight. The work is being done. The light is being kept. Whatever weight you have carried into this evening, you can set it down, just as the keeper sets down his small bundle of fuel at the base of the stairs before he begins his climb. The wind is outside the tower. It cannot reach you. The cold is outside the tower. It cannot reach you. The dangers of the dark sea are far below the rocks, and the rocks are far below the lantern. You are above all of it. You are in a small, warm circle of light, in the highest room of a stone tower, and around you the night is quiet, and the lamp is steady, and the keeper, that patient figure beside the flame, is keeping the watch so that you do not have to. Breathe in slowly. Let your shoulders drop a little further. Let your jaw unclench if it is clenched. Let your hands fall open. The keeper has done this same gentle settling 10,000 nights in a row beside his lamp. You can do it once tonight beside his memory. The flame is small. The flame is steady. The flame will keep burning long after you have drifted off. The keeper, in his quiet way, will watch it for you. He has done it for so many others, across so many centuries, that one more sleeping listener is no trouble at all to him. He is glad of the company, in his strange, shy way. He does not need you to speak. He does not need you to thank him. He only needs you to rest. So rest. The lamp is lit. The tower is sound. The sea is far below. The keeper is at his post. The night is long, but the work is being done. And the dawn, when it comes, will be slow and beautiful and far away. There is nothing for you to do until then. Nothing at all. Just rest. The lamp is burning. The keeper is keeping the watch. Before we let the keeper drift fully into the silence of his lamp, let us spend a little more time with him, because there are still corners of his world we have not yet visited. Quiet corners. Slow corners. The kind of corners you only notice when you have nowhere to go and nothing to do, which was, of course, the keeper's usual condition. Let us think for a while about the stories the keepers told themselves. Not the histories, not the facts, the stories. Because every keeper, sooner or later, became a quiet collector of strange tales about the sea, and these tales became part of the texture of his nights. The medieval sea was a place full of mysteries that no one had yet explained. Modern science had not yet reached out and named most of the things that happened on the water. So when a keeper saw something he could not understand, he had no laboratory to turn to, no textbook to consult. He simply took the strangeness into himself and let it sit there, sometimes for years, sometimes for the rest of his life. There were the lights, for instance. Almost every keeper, given enough years on his coast, eventually saw lights that he could not explain. Small green-blue flames dancing on the surface of the water on warm summer nights. Streaks of pale glow trailing behind moving waves. Patches of brightness, slow as drifting clouds, that moved across the dark sea and then faded without trace. These were, of course, mostly natural phenomena: bioluminescent plankton, marsh gas, reflections of moonlight on certain kinds of mist. But the keeper did not know that. He only knew that, on certain nights, when he should have been seeing nothing but black water, there was a soft alien light moving where no light should have been. He gave these lights names in his own private language. The friendly fires, perhaps. The fishermen below. The old captains, walking the waves. Some keepers came to believe that the lights were the souls of drowned sailors, gathering at certain times of the year to look up at the lighthouses that had not saved them. The keepers did not say this out loud. They simply watched the lights move, and felt in their hearts that they were being watched in return, and tended their lamps with a little extra care on those nights. There were the sounds, too. The sea in deep darkness, sometimes produced sounds that no keeper could quite identify. A long, low moan far out on the water. A series of slow, deliberate splashes, as though something very large was moving toward shore. A single high cry that might have been a seabird, but did not quite sound like any bird the keeper knew. These sounds were rare. A keeper might hear one of them only 2 or 3 times in his entire career. But once heard, they were not forgotten. He would lie awake afterward in his bed below, listening for the sound to come again, and feeling the small hairs on the back of his neck stand up in a way that no ordinary storm could produce. Some of these sounds modern science can explain. Whales calling to each other across great distances, walruses or seals surfacing in the night, currents pushing against unusual rock formations and producing strange resonances. But again, the keeper had no science. He had only the sound and the dark and his own imagination, which had been refined by years of listening until it could spin a whole story out of a single unfamiliar cry. He kept these stories mostly to himself. He did not write them down. He did not tell them to children. He did not even share them, often, with other keepers when they happened to meet. The stories were too private. They were too tied to particular nights, particular wind directions, particular states of his own mind. If he tried to speak them, they came out flat. They lost their meaning. So he kept them inside, like pebbles in a pocket, and turned them over in his hand sometimes, when the watch was very long and his mind needed somewhere to wander. There were also the legends that he had inherited from earlier keepers. Every lighthouse had its stories, passed down from old keeper to young one, in the few weeks of overlap when a retiring keeper trained his replacement. The young keeper would arrive, full of questions and energy. The old keeper would walk him around, show him the lamp, show him the cistern, show him the path to the village. And then, in the evenings, by the small fire in the lower room, the old keeper would say, in his slow, careful way, that there were certain things the young man ought to know about this particular tower. There might be a story about a keeper from 100 years before, who had supposedly seen a great ship sail past the tower on a calm summer night, even though there had been no wind and no other ships were known to be in the area. The ship in the story was very old-fashioned in its rigging, the kind of ship no one built anymore. It passed the lighthouse slowly, in complete silence, and then disappeared around the headland. By morning, no trace of it could be found. The old keeper would tell this story without comment, and the young keeper would not know whether to believe it, and the old keeper would not particularly care whether he believed it. The story was simply part of the place. It belonged to the tower. It was being handed over, along with the lamp and the keys. There might be a story about a particular rock at the base of the cliffs, where on certain stormy nights the spray was said to take human shapes. The shapes would rise out of the water, stand for a moment on the rock, and then collapse back into foam. Old keepers had claimed to see them. Young keepers would later claim to see them too. Whether they actually saw anything, or whether they only saw what they had been told to look for, was a question no one bothered to answer. There might be a story about a small chapel that had once stood near the lighthouse, before it had collapsed during a winter storm. The chapel was said to ring its bell, sometimes, even though the bell had been lost to the sea 2 centuries before. Keepers in the night, sitting by their lamps, would occasionally hear, somewhere on the wind, a thin ringing that did not quite belong to any of the modern sounds of the coast. They would tilt their heads. They would listen. The sound would fade. They would shrug and return to their watch. These stories were not exactly believed, and not exactly disbelieved. They were treated with a kind of gentle seriousness, the way one treats family memories that may or may not be exactly accurate. The lighthouse, like an old house with many rooms, accumulated such stories over the centuries. Each keeper added a few of his own, and inherited the ones that had come before. The accumulated weight of these stories was part of what made the place feel inhabited, even on the nights when only a single keeper was there. Let us think now about the small rituals of comfort the keeper invented for himself, because these were among the most personal and tender parts of his life. A keeper alone has nothing to lean on but his own habits. He cannot rely on the company of others to lift his spirits. He cannot expect that a visitor will arrive and distract him from a dark mood. If he wakes in the morning feeling heavy, he must lift himself. If he sits down to his evening meal feeling lonely, he must keep himself company. So he develops, over time, a quiet set of small comforts, each one carefully tended. One keeper might brew his morning herbal drink in a particular way. He would heat the water until just before it boiled, then take it off the flame, then add a small pinch of dried thyme from his garden, then let it steep for the exact length of time it took to walk twice around the lantern room. He would carry the cup in both hands and sit by the window and drink it slowly, watching the sea. The ritual was the same every morning. It was a small piece of ground he could stand on, regardless of what else was happening in his life. Another keeper might have a particular chair, in a particular corner, where he sat for a quarter of an hour every afternoon, doing nothing, not reading, not working, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting. The chair faced a window. The window faced a stretch of rocks. The keeper would watch the rocks. The rocks would not change. The keeper would feel, gradually, his own breathing slow, his shoulders relax, his thoughts settle. After a quarter of an hour, he would rise and continue his day, slightly steadier than before. Another keeper might keep a particular small object on the table beside his bed. A stone, perhaps, polished by the sea. A shell. A piece of driftwood carved into a rough shape years before. Each night, before sleeping, he would touch the object gently with one finger. It was not a religious gesture. He could not have explained it if asked. It was simply a way of marking the end of the day, of saying to himself, "This day is now over, and the next one will come when it comes." Another keeper might keep a small loaf of slightly better bread hidden in a tin in the corner of the kitchen. He would not eat from it most days. He would save it for the worst days, the days when the wind had been blowing for a week, and he could not stop himself from thinking about the village he had not visited in months. On those days, he would cut a thin slice of the better bread, eat it slowly, and feel that he had given himself a small gift. The gift was important. It said to him, "You are still a person worth giving things to." These rituals look small to a modern reader, perhaps even pitiable. A man alone in a tower, drinking thyme tea, touching a stone. But to the keeper, they were not small. They were the architecture of his sanity. They were what kept the long, formless time of his life from collapsing into a single endless grey watch. They made his days into days. They made his weeks into weeks. They turned the slow drift of his work into something with shape. A man who can keep his rituals is a man who can keep himself. And a man who can keep himself can keep the lamp. Let us also think for a while about the questions of memory and time, because these grew strange in the keeper's life, in ways that few other lives produced. For most medieval people, time was structured by external events. The bell of the village church rang the hours. The market opened on certain days. The harvests came at certain seasons. The neighbours were always doing something, and you could tell what time of day it was by what they were doing. Time, for the villager, was a public thing. It was carried in the air. You did not have to track it. For the keeper, time was much more private. The bells of the village were too far away to hear. The neighbours did not exist. The only public clock was the sun, and the sun in much of Europe was hidden behind cloud for large stretches of the year. So the keeper had to keep time for himself, using small internal markers that he developed gradually. He knew, for instance, that when he had drunk a particular amount of water from his morning jug, roughly an hour had passed. He knew that when his small fire downstairs had burned through a particular size of log, roughly 2 hours had passed. He knew that when the patch of sunlight on the western wall reached a particular crack in the stone, it was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, give or take. He knew that when a particular kind of gull began its evening crying, sunset was about an hour away. These rough markers were enough for his purposes. He did not need to know the exact hour. He needed to know roughly where in the day he was, so that he could pace his work and not be caught by the dark with the lamp unlit. And he became, over the years, very good at this rough sense of time. He could move through the day at the right pace without ever consulting a clock, because his body had become its own clock. But this same disconnection from external time did strange things to his memory. The days, all alike, sometimes blurred together. He would remember things, but not always remember exactly when they had happened. Was it 3 years ago, or 5, that the supply boat had been late by a month, and he had eaten only soup for the last 2 weeks? Was it last winter, or the one before, that the storm had broken the small window in the lantern room, and he had had to patch it with oiled cloth? Was it in his 4th year as keeper, or his 9th, that the young Irishman had stopped by with the cart of mended kettles and stayed 2 nights and told the wonderful long stories of his village? The keeper, in his old age, would sometimes try to put his memories in order and find that they would not cooperate. Certain events stood out very clearly, as bright as if they had happened yesterday. Other events were vague, soft, almost dissolved. The vivid ones were not always the most important ones. He might remember in perfect detail a particular morning in May when he had walked down to the shore and found a starfish in a tide pool and watched it for an hour. He might not remember, with anything like the same clarity, a serious storm that had nearly killed him. Memory chose what to keep, and his memory had its own preferences. This made his sense of his own life slightly dreamlike. He could not always tell, looking back, how much time had passed. The years did not feel evenly spaced. Some years felt long and crowded with events. Other years felt short and almost empty. The young keeper who had first climbed those stairs felt sometimes like a different person, almost a stranger, whom the old keeper remembered fondly but distantly. And sometimes, in particular moods, the young keeper felt like someone who had only just arrived, who was still inside him, surprised to find himself so old. This relationship to time is something modern people rarely experience because we are surrounded by external markers. The newspapers report the date every morning. The phone tells us the year. The seasons are softened by indoor heating. We do not lose ourselves in time the way the keeper did. We are constantly being reminded of where we are. The keeper had no such reminders. He drifted on the slow current of his work, and the current carried him along. And only at certain points, when he met a new traveller, or saw an unusual sight, did he look down and notice how far he had drifted. Many keepers in old age came to feel that their lives had been both very long and very short at the same time. Long, in the sense that they had lived through so many separate days, 10,000 or more, each one full of small moments. Short, in the sense that all those days had folded into each other, so that the whole career felt, in memory, like a single very long evening, beginning with the lighting of one lamp, and ending, eventually, with the putting out of another. There is something restful in this idea, when you let yourself sit with it. A life that does not insist on distinguishing every day from every other. A life where the days are allowed to flow together gently, like water into water. Modern life often forces us to mark every day as different, to remember every meeting, to record every event. The keeper did not have to do this. His days were free to dissolve into each other, and the dissolving was not a loss. It was a kind of peace. Let us now slowly turn our attention to the sea itself, the great unchanging companion of the keeper's life, because we have spoken about it in pieces, but not yet about its slow, vast presence as a whole. The sea, for the keeper, was not merely a body of water, it was a kind of country, with its own seasons, its own moods, its own internal politics. The keeper learnt this country as deeply as a farmer learns his land. He knew the place near the headland, where the current ran fast and the waves stood up tall. He knew the gentler patch in the lee of the rocks, where, on calm mornings, fish gathered in the warmer shallows. He knew the far line of reefs that, at low tide on certain days, showed their teeth like a slow grey mouth, and at high tide vanished entirely beneath the surface. He knew the deep channel where the merchant ships passed when they had the wind in their favour. He knew the longer route they took when the wind was against them. He knew the colours of the sea, and what each colour meant. A pale grey-green that meant the rains were coming inland but had not yet reached his coast. A deep navy that meant clear weather for at least a day. A milky white blue that meant a storm somewhere far out, even though his own sky was still clear. A flat slate that meant little wind for several days. A purplish black that meant nothing good. Each colour had its message. He read them as easily as a man reads a familiar handwriting. He knew the sounds the sea made too. There were the obvious sounds of waves on rocks, but there were also subtler sounds. The sound of the sea against sand was different from the sound against pebbles, which was different from the sound against stone. The sound of a wave breaking close was different from a wave breaking far. The sound of the sea on a windless night, when the swell was rolling in from a storm 100 miles away, had a particular slow rhythm that the keeper found beautiful and slightly sad. He could not have explained why it was sad. It simply was. He knew the smells. The smell of salt, of course, was constant, but the strength of the salt smell changed with the weather. On certain windy days it was sharp and almost stinging in the nostrils. On calm days it was softer, mingled with the smell of seaweed and wet rocks. After a big storm, the smell of the sea sometimes had a fishy edge, because so many small creatures had been thrown up onto the rocks and were drying in the morning sun. After a long calm spell, the smell of the sea grew flatter, almost stale, as though the water itself had grown bored of being still. He knew the life of the sea, the things that lived in it and around it. He knew the seasons of the fish. He knew when the herring came in great silver clouds, when the mackerel arrived chasing them, when the cod sank to the deeper grounds, when the small flatfish settled in the sandy shallows. He knew the seasons of the birds. He knew when the puffins returned in spring, when the gannets dived for fish in their dramatic dives from 100 feet up, when the cormorants stood on the rocks with their wings spread to dry, looking like small black crosses on the grey stone. He knew the seasons of the seals. He knew when they came ashore to give birth to their pups, and when the pups were old enough to swim, and when the whole colony slipped back into the water and disappeared for several months. All this knowledge had no practical use in the strict sense. It did not help him tend his lamp. It did not earn him money. It did not produce any object that could be sold or admired. It simply accumulated in him, year by year, like silt slowly building up at the mouth of a river. It made him, gradually, into a particular kind of person. A person who knew his place. A person whose mind was full of the small specific facts of his small specific stretch of coast. This kind of knowledge in the modern world is rare. We move so much. We do not stay in one place long enough to gather it. We have books and websites that can give us facts about almost anywhere. But we do not have the slow, intimate knowing that comes only from staying. The keeper had that knowing. He had nothing else in some ways, but he had that, and the having of it was in itself a kind of wealth. A wealth that he could not have explained to anyone, that he could not have spent in a market, that no thief could have stolen. A wealth that grew quietly inside him, year after year, and stayed with him to the end. Let us drift now toward the night, the deep middle of the night, the hours when even most owls are silent and the world feels emptied of everything except the few people who must be awake. In those deep hours, between roughly 2 and 4 in the morning, the keeper had a particular kind of consciousness that he developed only after many years of work. It was not exactly alertness, it was not exactly drowsiness, it was something in between, a soft watchful state, in which the mind was open to the world but did not insist on doing anything with what it received. The keeper, in these hours, might sit by his lamp with his eyes half closed. He might not be looking at anything in particular. The flame would burn beside him, steady. The wind would speak quietly outside. The sea, in calm weather, would barely make a sound. The keeper's breath would slow. His heart would slow. His thoughts, such as they were, would slow with everything else. This was, in some sense, the deepest state of his work. The active labour of climbing and lighting and refuelling was finished, at least for the moment. The lamp was burning well. There was nothing immediate to do. He was simply being present, being there, being awake so that the lamp could be tended if anything went wrong, but not actively tending anything in this very moment. It is hard to describe this state to someone who has never spent long hours alone at night. It is not boredom, because boredom requires expectation, and the keeper had no expectation. It is not meditation exactly, though it shares something with meditation. It is something like the state of a still pond. The water is there, the fish are there, the reflections of the sky are there. Nothing is moving very much, and the pond, in being so still, becomes capable of holding more than a moving pond could hold. The keeper in these hours would sometimes feel that he was the still pond. The world was reflected in him. He was holding it gently, without disturbing it. The flame of the lamp was in him. The dark sea outside was in him. The slow movement of the stars overhead, when the sky was clear, was in him. He was not separate from them. He was the still place where they could be present at the same time. This sounds mystical, perhaps, but it was not for the keepers anything dramatic. It was simply what happened when a person sat alone, in the dark, beside a small flame, for thousands of nights in a row. The mind, given enough silence, settles into shapes it cannot find when it is busier. The keeper was not trying to find any particular state. The state simply arrived in its own time, and the keeper let it. He might have a small bowl of soup beside him, slowly cooling. He might have a half-finished piece of carving in his hand, but not actually be moving the knife. He might have his other hand resting on his knee. The shadow of his hand, in the firelight of his small lamp below, would be very still. The shadow of his shoulder on the wall behind him would not move. He would be more still than he had been at any other time of the day. And then, somewhere out beyond the windows, a wave would slap against the rocks a little harder than usual. The keeper would tilt his head just slightly to listen. The state would not be broken. It would simply include the new sound. The wave would die away. The keeper would settle back. The lamp would continue to burn. In these deep hours, the keeper often felt the closest to whatever larger thing he believed in. Some keepers thought of it as God. Some thought of it as the soul of the sea, or the spirits of the dead sailors, or the long line of keepers stretching back through the centuries. Some did not name it at all. They simply felt it, a great quiet presence around them, that the lamp seemed somehow to acknowledge. The lamp, burning in the dark, was a small word spoken aloud by the keeper, on behalf of all of humanity, to whatever was listening. I am still here. We are still here. We have not given up. We are keeping the watch. This was not a religion exactly. It was something older and softer than religion. It was the basic gesture of a creature with eyes and hands, set down on a planet full of darkness, who has decided to make a small light and tend it and not let it go out. The keeper, in the deepest hours of his deepest nights, became that gesture. He did not have to think about it. He had become it through sheer repetition. He was the gesture itself. Let us drift toward a particular long-ago morning, just as an example, just to feel what one such morning might have been like, in a particular tower, in a particular keeper's life. Imagine an old keeper in his 40th year of service. He has been tending the same tower since he was a young man of 23. He is now in his 60s. His hair has gone almost entirely white. His eyes are paler than they used to be, and they water sometimes in the cold wind. But they still see his lamp well enough. His hands are stiffer than they once were, but they still know the small motions of trimming the wick. His back aches when he climbs the stairs, but he still climbs them, every evening, in the same slow rhythm he has used for 40 years. On this particular morning, he has finished his night watch and put out the lamp. The dawn has come over the eastern hills, grey and slow, with a thin band of pink behind the higher clouds. The sea is calm. The seabirds are starting their morning calls. The world is in its quietest moment, after the long night and before the small bustle of the village morning. The old keeper descends the stairs, slowly. He pauses on each landing to rest. His knees ache, his breath is short. He does not mind. He has the whole day ahead of him with nothing pressing. He is in no hurry. At the bottom of the tower, he steps outside. He walks a few yards to a low stone bench that sits against the eastern wall of his small cottage. He sits down. He puts his hands on his knees. He looks at the sea. The sea is silver this morning. There is almost no wind. The water rises and falls in a slow, soft swell, and where the surface catches the first sunlight, it gleams like beaten metal. A few seabirds float on it, perfectly at ease. A single fishing boat, far out, is just barely visible. Its small sail catches the light, then loses it, then catches it again as the boat rocks gently in the swell. The old keeper does not think of anything in particular. He simply watches. He has watched this view, in some version 10,000 times before. The view has never been exactly the same twice. The water is different every morning. The sky is different. The light is different. The position of the boats and the birds is different. But the shape of the watching is always the same. The keeper sits. The sea rolls. The day begins. He thinks, distantly, that he has done a good night's work. The lamp burned well. The wick was trimmed correctly. He had to add oil only once in the small hours, which is excellent for this time of year. No ships came close enough to the rocks to cause concern. No strange lights appeared on the water. No unexplained sounds came in on the wind. The night, in his professional judgment, was uneventful, which is the kind of night a keeper hopes for. The boring nights, after all, are the successful nights. The dramatic nights, the nights of storms and wrecks, are the failures, even when the keeper himself did everything he could. He has had many uneventful nights in his 40 years. He has also had a smaller number of dramatic ones. He remembers them in fragments. The big storm of his second winter, when the lantern room glass cracked and he had to wedge a board against it with his shoulder for hours. The strange calm night in his 9th year, when he heard distant singing across the water and could never figure out where it came from. The shipwreck in his 16th year, when he had pulled 3 half-drowned men up the cliff path and given them his only spare blanket. The day in his 22nd year, when his wife had died, very suddenly, of a fever, and he had had to walk down to the village to arrange her burial, and then walk back up alone and light the lamp that evening, because the lamp did not care about his grief. He remembers her face, his wife's, in flashes. She had been a small woman with quick hands. She had been good with the kitchen garden. She had liked the smell of the sea after rain. She had laughed at his bad jokes, of which he had had a steady supply in those years, though he tells few of them now. He has not married again. He thinks of her sometimes. He has come to feel, in his old age, that she is still present in some quiet way. He has had so many silent conversations with her while sitting beside his lamp at night that he no longer feels she has fully left. He thinks too of his son. His son grew up in this lighthouse. His son climbed these stairs as a child. His son helped him pump oil and clean the wick and gather seabird eggs in the spring. His son left at 18 to go to sea himself. His son sends letters when he can from various ports along the coast. The old keeper cannot read, but he has the priest in the village read the letters to him when he visits. The son is alive, the son is well. The son has children of his own now, in some inland town the old keeper has never seen. The old keeper is glad of all of this, and only occasionally, in his quietest moments, does he wish that the son had stayed. He thinks, too, of the young man who will eventually replace him. The young man has not yet arrived. The arrangement has been made with the local lord that, when the old keeper finally feels too tired to continue, a younger man will come to take over. The old keeper does not know yet exactly when this will be. He still feels capable. He still feels useful. But he is aware, as anyone of his age would be, that his last lighting of the lamp is not as far away as it once was. Perhaps 2 more years, perhaps 3, perhaps 5, if his back holds up. When the young man comes, the old keeper will show him everything: the stairs, the lamp, the wicks, the oil barrels, the cistern, the path, the garden, the shape of the wind in each season, the names of the rocks, the signs of weather, the stories. The keeper has decided, in his old age, that he will not hold any of his knowledge back. He will give all of it to the young man, as freely as he can, even though most of it will not be understood until the young man has lived through his own seasons. The old keeper accepts this. He had to learn his own lessons in his own seasons. The new keeper will do the same. The knowledge will pass, imperfectly, in the only way knowledge ever really passes. And then, when the new keeper is settled, the old keeper will walk down to the village and find a small cottage there, and live out his final years among neighbours. He will sit in the doorway in the evenings and watch the path that leads up to the lighthouse. He will see the lamp, when night falls, burning at the top of the tower. He will know that it is being tended by the young man now. He will feel perhaps a small ache. He will also feel perhaps a deep contentment. The work continues, the light continues. He has done his part, and now his part is over, and the world is still turning. But all of this is in the future, on the morning we are imagining. On the morning we are imagining, the old keeper is still in service. He has just put out his lamp after a calm night. He is sitting on his stone bench, watching the silver sea. The sun is rising. The world is quiet. A fishing boat is far out on the swell. The seabirds are starting their morning calls. The old keeper is at peace. After a while, he rises slowly from the bench. He walks back into his cottage. He puts on his kettle, hangs it over the small morning fire. He cuts a slice of bread from yesterday's loaf. He sits down at his table. He eats slowly. He drinks slowly. He does not need to hurry. He has the whole day ahead of him to do the small daily tasks. He will sleep in a few hours when the light gets stronger and his eyes get heavier. He will wake up in the afternoon. He will tend to the garden. He will polish a piece of brass on the lamp. He will walk down to the shore at low tide and gather shellfish. He will come back. He will eat his evening meal. He will rest briefly. And then, as he has done 10,000 times before, he will climb the stairs at dusk and light the lamp and sit beside it through the night. There is nothing extraordinary about any of this. It is in fact almost monotonous. And yet there is a quiet beauty in it. The beauty of a life that has narrowed itself to a single useful task and performed that task faithfully, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. We sometimes imagine in the modern world that a meaningful life must be a busy life. We imagine that meaning is found in achievement, in recognition, in variety. The medieval lighthouse keeper would not have understood this. He would have looked at his lamp, and at the dark sea below his tower, and at the long line of his predecessors and successors stretching back into the past and forward into the future. And he would have said, quietly, that meaning is found in a thing being kept, a flame being kept, a watch being kept, a promise being kept. The keeping is the meaning. He would not have said it that articulately, perhaps. He would have just shrugged and gone back to trimming the wick. But that is, in his quiet way, what he would have meant. Let us stay with him a little longer, because we are nearly at the end of our long walk together, and the keeper deserves our company for a few more minutes. Consider for a moment the small physical postures of his life. The way he sat, the way he stood, the way he walked. These had been shaped over 40 years into very particular forms. When he sat by his lamp at night, he sat slightly forward, with his hands on his knees, his back curved gently, his head slightly tilted, as though he were always listening for something. This posture had developed over so many years that it had become his natural shape. Even when he was sitting on the bench outside, watching the morning sea, he sat the same way. The shape of his body was the shape of a man whose work was to listen. When he stood by the lamp, perhaps to trim the wick, he stood with his weight on his left foot, his right foot slightly behind. This was the posture that gave him the steadiest hand. Over the years, the small muscles in his back and shoulders had arranged themselves around this stance. He could hold it for long stretches without growing tired. When he walked the spiral stairs, he placed his hand on the inner wall, the wall that curved tightly around the central column of the tower. The stone of that wall, in a particular vertical strip about the height of a man's chest, was polished smooth from generations of keepers brushing it with their hands as they climbed. The old keeper's hand fit perfectly into the worn place, as though the stone had been shaped for him personally. In some sense, of course, it had been. Generations of hands like his had shaped it. He was simply the most recent inheritor. When he walked on the rocks below the cliff, gathering shellfish, he walked in a particular crouched way, low to the ground, weight slightly forward, ready to catch himself if a wet stone shifted under his foot. This walk had been taught to him in his first years on the coast by his predecessor, and he had practiced it until it became automatic. Now, even on dry ground, he sometimes walked in this slight forward crouch, because his body did not know how to walk any other way. When he climbed the path back up to the tower, he walked in a slow, steady rhythm, one foot in front of the other, never hurrying, never stopping, until he reached the top. He had learned over the years that this slow, steady pace was the only way to climb the path without exhausting himself, especially in his old age. He no longer raced up the path the way he had at 23. He climbed it the way he climbed his stairs, with patience. All of these small physical habits, in their quiet way, were a record of his life. His body had been written on by his work. The muscles, the bones, the very angles of his standing and walking. He carried his career inside himself, in every gesture. A doctor, examining him, could probably have guessed what he did for a living, just from the shape of his shoulders and the way he sat. But of course, no doctor ever examined him. He lived too far from any doctor for that to be possible. His body was for himself, and for his work, and for no one else. Consider also his clothing, because the clothes the keeper wore were as much a part of him as his postures. He wore wool, almost always, thick wool tunic over a linen shirt, thick wool breeches, thick wool stockings, a heavy wool cloak when the weather demanded it. His clothes were not new. Some of them were quite old, mended many times over the years. The keeper had become skilled at mending out of necessity. He could darn a stocking, patch a tunic, replace a worn-out collar with a strip of new wool stitched neatly along the edge. His clothes were not fashionable. They had probably not been fashionable when they were made. They were simply functional and warm and his. His boots were leather, oiled regularly with the fat of seabirds or fish to keep the water out. The boots had been resoled twice in his memory, and the upper leather was cracked in several places. But the keeper had patched the cracks with smaller pieces of leather sewn over them, and the boots still kept his feet dry through most weather. He took the boots off every night when he sat down to his watch in the lantern room, and put on a pair of soft leather slippers, because he liked to feel close to the floor when he was working. The boots stood by the door of the lantern room, waiting for him to put them back on in the morning. He had a hat for cold weather, a sort of soft wool cap that pulled down over his ears. He had a wider-brimmed straw hat for sunny summer days, which he had woven himself, badly, many years before. He had a leather belt that he had been wearing for nearly 30 years. The buckle had been replaced once. The leather had been oiled so many times that it was almost black. The belt had moulded itself to the exact shape of his waist, and when he put it on each morning, it slid into place without his even having to look at it. His personal possessions, beyond his clothes, were very few. A small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. In the chest, a folded extra tunic, a spare pair of stockings, a leather purse with a small amount of silver in it, the few letters his son had sent him, a worn piece of paper with the name of his wife written on it by the village priest, and a single small carved wooden figure of a fish that his son had made for him at the age of 9. That was all. The whole of his material life, after 60-some years of living, fit into one wooden chest, with room to spare. The simplicity of his belongings did not feel impoverished to him. It felt right. He had what he needed. He had no use for more. He had seen, on his rare visits to the village, the cluttered cottages of the villagers, full of pots and tools and small wooden ornaments and tapestries on the walls. He had not envied them. He had felt, if anything, a quiet relief at returning to his own spare rooms, where every object had a purpose, and every surface was bare and clean. This kind of simplicity is hard to imagine in a modern world where most people own thousands of objects. But the keeper would not have understood the modern accumulation. He would have asked gently what each thing was for, and he would have listened to the answer and nodded politely, and then walked back up to his tower and trimmed his wick and sat down beside his lamp. Let us drift now toward the close, the very close, with the keeper still in our company. It is evening again. The day we imagined, that calm summer day, has passed. The keeper has done his usual small tasks. He has rested. He has eaten. He has visited the cistern to check the water level. He has watched the late afternoon light slide slowly across the wall of his cottage, and felt that it was a beautiful light, as it always was in late summer, golden and slow, and full of something he could not name. Now the sun is settling toward the western horizon. The sea is darker than it was at noon, a deep blue-grey, with small ripples catching the orange of the dying light. The seabirds have grown quieter. A few are still calling, but their cries have the soft quality that means they are settling for the night. The wind has dropped almost entirely. The world is moving into its long evening stillness. The keeper rises from his bench. He goes inside the cottage. He takes a heavy flint and steel from a shelf. He takes a small clay lamp already filled with oil. He takes a folded cloth in case he needs to wipe anything. He takes a small bundle of trimmed wicks in case the great lamp needs a fresh one. He has done these preparations so many times that his hands do them without thought. He steps outside. He looks once more at the sea. The first faint stars are beginning to show in the eastern sky. He nods, very slightly, to no one. Then he walks to the door of the tower, opens it, and steps inside. The stairs rise before him in their slow, tight spiral. He places his hand on the worn place on the inner wall. He begins to climb. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. He pauses on the landing of the middle floor to catch his breath. He continues. 8 steps, 9, 10. Another pause. He is in no hurry. The sun is still above the horizon. He has time. He reaches the lantern room. The light here is still bright with the last sunlight coming through the windows. The great lamp stands in the centre of the room, its brass body gleaming faintly in the soft glow. The wick is fresh. The reservoir is full. Everything is as he left it this morning. He sets down his bundle. He takes a slow breath. He turns and looks out the western window at the setting sun. The sun is now just touching the horizon. The sky around it is gold and pink and a deep, slow orange. The clouds are edged in fire. The sea, between the keeper and the sun, is a rippling sheet of light. He watches. He does not move. He simply watches. After several minutes, the sun begins to sink below the horizon. The light grows softer. The colours fade from gold to pink to deep dusty purple. The sea grows dim. The sky grows dim. The world is dimming all at once. The keeper turns from the window. He kneels by the lamp. He strikes his flint against his steel. A small spark flies. It catches on the dry tinder in the small clay lamp. A tiny flame appears. He cups his hand around it, gently, to protect it. He carries the flame to the great lamp. He touches it to the wick. The wick catches. The flame steadies. The light spreads. The great lamp begins to burn. The keeper steps back. He looks at the flame. It is strong and steady. It will burn through the night. He will be here with it. He will watch it. He will tend it. The ships far out on the dark sea will see it. The captains will know where the rocks are. The crews will be safe. He sits down in his chair. He arranges his blanket over his knees. He places his clay lamp on the small table beside him. He folds his hands. He closes his eyes for a moment, then opens them again. He looks at the great lamp. The flame moves, very slightly, in a small draught. It steadies. The keeper watches. The night begins. And here, in this moment, the keeper passes out of our story. Not because he stops existing. He does not stop existing. He keeps the watch, as he has kept the watch for 40 years, until he himself is finally relieved by the young man who will come from the village, or by the gentler relief of age and death. The keeper continues, in his quiet way, for as long as he needs to continue. But we, the listeners, can release him now. We can let him keep his watch without our attention. We can drift away from his lantern room into our own warm bed, our own quiet darkness, our own small flame somewhere in the back of our minds. The keeper does not need us to stay. He is not lonely in our absence. He has been alone many thousands of times before. He is, in his way, content with the solitude. He has the lamp. He has the sea. He has the long, slow night. Let yourself drift now. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. The keeper is on his stool. The lamp is on its stand. The flame is burning. The dark sea is below. The ships are far away. The night is long and gentle, and full of nothing you need to do. If your eyes are still open, you can let them close. If they are already closed, you can let them stay closed. There is nothing left to listen for. The story has carried you to its quiet ending, and now the story rests, and you rest with it. The lamp is burning. The wind is far away. The keeper is at his post. The night is keeping itself. There is nothing more just now. Nothing more to imagine. Nothing more to remember. Nothing more to hold on to. The whole story can be set down, gently, like a small lit candle set on a stone shelf, where it will be safe through the night. You do not need to think of the keeper anymore. You do not need to think of his tower. You do not need to think of the sea, or the stairs, or the lamp, or the wick. They are all there, They will all be there in the morning. The keeper is keeping them for you. He is very good at keeping things. He has been doing it for 40 years. Your only task now is to rest. Breathe in. Breathe out. The lamp is burning at the top of the tower. The keeper is sitting beside it. The night is moving slowly across the world, as it always does, and as it always will. You are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you need to be. The flame is small. The flame is steady. The flame will be there in the morning, with the dawn coming up behind it, and the sea showing itself again, and the seabirds beginning their morning calls. But none of that is yet. All of that is later. For now there is only the night, and the lamp, and the keeper, and you. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. The keeper is keeping the watch. The light is being kept. Everything is being kept. You can let go now. You can let go. Let go. Good night.